Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment to quiet your mind, wherever you are. This is slow storytelling, whether you're winding down before sleep, working with headphones, or just letting the hours drift by. If you value thoughtful, long-form science told softly, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps this kind of careful, educational content reach more people who'd rather conquer the world with knowledge than with noise. I'd love to hear in the comments when and where you join us. Some of you listen before bed, others while driving, cooking, even showering. Or tell us what place in the world you're watching from. And if you happen to drift off during tonight's story, don't worry. I've added timestamps in the description so you can return tomorrow and pick up right where you left. Because this story is worth hearing all the way through. This is soft science, not wild speculation. A humble attempt to trace what evidence really shows, while admitting how much we still don't know. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Tonight's story begins 70,000 years ago, when one small tribe stepped onto the stage of history. How did fewer than 10,000 humans set the stage for everything? It is a question that sounds impossible on the surface, and yet the genetic record insists that something like this once happened. At a certain point in the deep past, our species nearly blinked out. The evidence suggests that the ancestors of nearly every human alive outside of Africa today descend from a surprisingly tiny remnant, a fragile ember of survival that carried forward through an age of ice, drought, and unpredictability. If you are listening now, you are the product of one of the narrowest escapes in all of natural history. The story begins around 70,000 years ago, when Earth was not kind to our kind. Global climate was shifting violently. Long before we carried the technologies or large cooperative societies that would later define us, the environment itself was the most decisive force. In Africa, where the lineage of Homo sapiens was rooted, conditions were lurching from wet to dry with such speed that once fertile regions could become barren deserts within centuries. The record of ancient lakes and riverbeds shows expansions and contractions that would have forced animals and people alike to move or die. For small bands of hunter-gatherers, these changes were not minor inconveniences but existential pressures. It is from this ecological backdrop that we infer a population bottleneck. The evidence comes not from fossil counts alone, but from the genomes of people living today. When geneticists scan the diversity of human DNA, they see a pattern that can only be explained if the number of our ancestors sharply contracted. Instead of tens or hundreds of thousands of breeding individuals, the pool shrank to something on the order of fewer than 10,000, perhaps only a few thousand. To grasp the scale, imagine an entire species of humans reduced to the population of a modern town, scattered into small and often isolated groups. That was the ember that survived. Why did this contraction occur? The answer is not a single catastrophe, but a convergence of stresses. Climatic data from ice cores and marine sediments point to one of the most severe glacial advances in the last 500,000 years. Africa's monsoons weakened. Regions that had once offered corridors of green turned to dry wastelands. Many animal species suffered collapses at the same time. The shrinking habitats would have pinched human groups into isolated refuges. Instead of roaming widely, they became trapped in ecological islands, some near coasts, some clinging to river valleys or upland zones where rainfall still lingered. In such circumstances, the difference between survival and extinction could hinge on a freshwater spring, a seasonal migration route, or the luck of following herds that had not yet vanished. The genetics tell another subtle truth. This bottleneck did not erase all variation, but it slashed it down to a minimal thread. Every non-African today can trace ancestry to this narrow window, but within Africa the picture remained more complex. Populations there preserved deeper lineages that never fully collapsed in the same way. Yet the strand that carried humans beyond Africa, the one that would ultimately fill the continents, comes from this fragile ember of fewer than 10,000. It was not inevitable. A slightly drier century, or one more river system drying out, and perhaps the ember would have gone dark. For scientists, the challenge is that the fossil record from this exact period is sparse. Bones decay quickly in the climates of Africa and Arabia, and caves that might preserve them are rare. Instead, we must lean on indirect data. The genetic bottleneck, the signs of reduced diversity, the climatic reconstructions. The picture is one of scattered small groups barely maintaining continuity. When geneticists model such scenarios, they find that populations that small face a constant risk of losing diversity altogether. Without occasional mixing between bands, harmful mutations accumulate, fertility drops, and extinction follows. The very fact that we are here suggests that those isolated groups must have reconnected just often enough to exchange genes and recharge the dwindling pool of variation. In other words, survival was not only about enduring droughts and finding food, but about finding each other. If fewer than 10,000 individuals carried the line, what was life like for them? Archaeology offers glimpses, though they are faint. At coastal sites in East Africa from roughly this time, stone tools appear alongside shells that may have been gathered for food. The implication is that groups clustered near coasts found in marine resources a buffer against famine when inland herds disappeared. Other refugees may have been along the Rift Valley lakes, where fish and water birds could sustain small bands. The reliance on such patchy and localized resources explains why populations could not remain large. They were constrained by the carrying capacity of these fragile refuges. It is tempting to imagine these survivors as heroic, but their existence was more likely precarious. Infant mortality would have been high. Droughts would have caused entire groups to vanish. Diseases that swept through such small populations could leave none behind, and yet some survived. Perhaps they had slightly more flexible diets, or social structures that allowed cooperation in lean times. Perhaps they simply happened to occupy the right patch of ground when the climate shifted back to slightly wetter conditions. What we can say is that the continuity was narrow and fragile, a thread that could have snapped many times. The scale of what followed makes the bottleneck even more remarkable. From those few thousand individuals came the billions alive today, along with the astonishing diversity of cultures, languages, and histories. But at the moment of the Ember, none of that was guaranteed. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, it is one of the most extreme near-extinction events experienced by a large mammal that nonetheless rebounded to global dominance. That contrast is one reason scientists remain so captivated by it. Of course, there are uncertainties. Some scholars argue that the bottleneck may have been less severe than early estimates suggested, or that it was uneven across regions. Perhaps certain pockets of Africa maintained larger numbers while others collapsed. Perhaps the genetic signal reflects not only population size but also structure, with groups separated for long periods before reconnecting. As in so many areas of human origins research, the models are approximations subject to revision when new evidence appears. What is consistent is the overall picture. At some point, the ancestors of the global population passed through an eye of the needle. The haunting question is why it was our species and not others that endured this narrowing. At the same time, archaic humans like Neanderthals and Denisovans were thriving elsewhere. But for the purpose of this moment, we set them aside. The ember of modern humans held on in Africa, through climate swings that could easily have erased it. What mattered was not superiority, but survival. The fire almost went out, and yet it did not. When you sit with that fact, the perspective shifts. Every language, every story, every scientific achievement traces back not to an endless multitude, but to a handful of communities pressed against the margins of habitability. They were not conquerors yet. They were not even secure. They were simply surviving. And yet survival was enough. From survival came the possibility of everything else. So how did fewer than 10,000 humans set the stage for everything? By not giving in to the silence of extinction, by holding a thread of continuity through drought and hardship, by maintaining just enough diversity, just enough connection, and just enough luck to keep the ember alive. The ember burned faintly, but it endured. From it, the fire of humanity would spread across the world. The answer is humble, unsatisfying, and profound all at once. They simply did not die out, and that is why the story of 70,000 years ago still matters. It reminds us that our existence is contingent, fragile, and dependent on forces far beyond our control. The ember that survived was not inevitable. It was an accident of climate, geography, and persistence. The haunting question remains: how many times has life on this planet come down to such narrow threads, and how many times in the future will it do so again? Why were there so many humans that were not us? The question feels strange because today we live in a world with only one surviving branch of the human family. But if you could step back into the deep past, between 300,000 and 70,000 years ago, the planet would feel crowded in ways we can scarcely imagine. At that time, the genus Homo was not a single experiment, but an entire collection of parallel lineages, each with its own history, anatomy, and ecological niche. To look across this period is to realise that what we call humanity was not a singular destiny, but one of many competing options. When paleoanthropologists dig into layers from this era, they do not find a clean story. Instead, they find skulls with heavy brows and elongated vaults in Europe, delicate and miniature skeletons on an Indonesian island, robust jaws in China, and mosaic combinations in Africa. Some of these fossils we can name confidently, like the Neanderthals. Others we name with hesitation, like the Denisovans, and still others remain enigmatic, whispered about only as archaic Africans whose bones have not yielded clear DNA. The diversity is not just a matter of geography, but of adaptation. Each of these human relatives carved out survival in particular ecological spaces, shaped by the demands of climate, prey, and terrain. The most familiar rivals in this story are the Neanderthals. They emerged in Western Eurasia sometime after 400,000 years ago, descended from earlier populations of Homo heidelbergensis. Their skeletons tell a tale of adaptation to cold glacial climates, wide rib cages for powerful lungs, stout bodies that conserved heat, and large noses that may have warmed the air. They mastered fire, fashioned stone tools of remarkable sophistication, and lived in bands that hunted large animals across Ice Age steppes and forests. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were not marginal but dominant across Europe and parts of Western Asia. Far from the caricature of brutish cavemen, they were highly competent humans in their own right, shaped by different pressures than those that moulded our species. To the east, another branch took shape, one that would only be recognised in the 21st century. The Denisovans are known not from a wealth of skeletons, but from the invisible record of DNA, first extracted from a finger bone in a Siberian cave. Their physical form remains almost entirely mysterious. Fragments suggest they were robust, but little more can be said with certainty. What is clear is that they were widespread, leaving genetic traces not only in Siberia but across Asia and into Oceania. Populations in Tibet today carry Denisovan-derived genes that help them thrive at high altitude, an echo of an adaptation once honed in another lineage. The Denisovans remind us that much of the human past is still invisible, hidden in bone powder and unexcavated sites. Entire populations may have thrived for hundreds of millennia without leaving us more than a few ghostly fragments of DNA. Even stranger were the tiny humans of Southeast Asia. On the island of Flores, fossils dating to around 100,000 years ago reveal a species we call Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbits. Standing little more than a metre tall with brains 1/3 the size of ours, they crafted stone tools and hunted small animals on their island home. Their diminutive size was likely a product of island dwarfism, the same evolutionary rule that produces miniature elephants and giant rats in isolated ecosystems. Homo floresiensis challenges the assumption that only large brains could sustain complex behaviour. They lived for thousands of generations, entirely adapted to their unique environment, showing that humanity could take radically different forms and still persist. Other lineages push the boundaries of what we think we know. In the Philippines, stone tools and bones suggest another small-bodied species, Homo luzonensis, existing well into the late Pleistocene. In southern Africa, fossils of Homo naledi show a strange mixture of primitive and modern traits, with small brains but hands and feet shaped for both climbing and tool use. In China, robust archaic skulls defy simple classification, hinting at populations that may have been cousins of Denisovans or yet another lineage altogether. The pattern is consistent. The world was full of experiments in being human, not one but many. Africa itself, the cradle of Homo sapiens, was not a uniform landscape of our ancestors, but a patchwork of archaic populations. Fossils from sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dating to around 300,000 years ago, show faces that look startlingly modern, paired with skull shapes that remain elongated and archaic. Other African finds reveal still more variation. suggesting that the continent hosted multiple semi-isolated groups that sometimes mixed and sometimes diverged. Genetic studies confirm this picture of deep substructure. Ancient African populations were as different from one another as Neanderthals and modern humans were, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, yet occasionally reconnecting. This braided stream of populations complicates any simple origin story. To ask where Homo sapiens came from is to accept that the answer may be from many places at once. The ecological niches occupied by these different humans were as varied as their forms. Neanderthals thrived in Ice Age Europe, stalking mammoths and bison across periglacial steppes. Denisovans seem to have ranged across vast parts of Asia, from temperate forests to high-altitude plateaus. The hobbits of Floras lived in tropical island ecosystems where isolation shaped every trait. In Africa, archaic humans adapted to environments from savanna to rainforest, tracking shifting climates across millennia. Each group was not merely surviving, but flourishing in its own space, with behaviours and adaptations tuned to local demands. It is humbling to realise how little we know about many of them. We can list the tool cultures of Neanderthals and sometimes reconstruct their hunting strategies from cut-marked bones. We can analyse the DNA of Denisovans and infer their presence from genetic echoes. But for species like Homo naledi or Homo luzonensis, we have only fragments of skeletons and guesses at behaviour. They remind us that our fossil record is still incomplete, a tiny sample of what once was. Entire civilizations of hominins may have risen and fallen without leaving us more than a handful of teeth. Yet for all this diversity, none of these lineages exist today. That fact is both obvious and haunting. We live in a monoculture of humanity, one branch where once there were many. It is tempting to jump ahead and ask why, to imagine reasons for our survival and their disappearance. But for now, the point is simply to recognise that the world we inhabit, with only one humankind, is unusual. For most of the last million years, diversity was the norm. Our species was one among many, not the inevitable heir. The haunting question remains, what would it have felt like to live in such a world? To walk across a valley and know that another kind of human lived over the ridge? To encounter faces both familiar and foreign, eyes that mirrored your own but bodies built on different blueprints? We cannot truly know, but the evidence suggests that such encounters were not rare. The world of rivals was a braided world, where boundaries between populations were sometimes sharp and sometimes porous. For hundreds of thousands of years, the story of humanity was not a single line, but a tangled web of coexisting species. Why were there so many humans that were not us? Because evolution never runs a single experiment. It tries many paths at once, discarding some, prolonging others, testing variations across continents and climates. Between 300,000 and 70,000 years ago, the planet was not waiting for us. It was already filled with others who had as much claim to the title of human as we do. Their disappearance is a later chapter. For this moment in time, they were the world. What does our DNA really say about our family tree? On the surface, the answer seems simple. We imagine a branching diagram, one line for modern humans, another for Neanderthals, another for Denisovans, splitting neatly from a shared ancestor like the limbs of a well-pruned tree. But as ancient DNA has been pulled from bones and teeth over the last 2 decades, that neat diagram has begun to warp. The picture that emerges looks less like a clean branching tree, and more like a tangled braid of lineages, sometimes separating, sometimes rejoining, and often carrying genetic threads we did not expect. The conventional model long held that modern humans diverged from a lineage shared with Neanderthals and Denisovans somewhere between 500,000 years ago and 500,000 years ago and 750,000 years ago. This sister group model presented us as one half of the split, with the Neanderthal-Denisovan clade on the other. For many years that model was serviceable, explaining the broad patterns in genome-wide comparisons. But as sequencing techniques improved, inconsistencies appeared. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA told a different story than the rest of the genome. While the autosomes suggested a split between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens roughly 600,000 years ago, both the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA pointed to a much more recent common ancestor, only 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. This discrepancy puzzled geneticists. How could 2 parts of the genome, passed strictly down the paternal and maternal lines, tell such a different story than the rest of the DNA? One explanation proposed was gene flow, that modern human ancestors passed some genetic material into the Neanderthal lineage long after their initial separation. In this view, a pulse of DNA from early Homo sapiens or a closely related population could have swept through Neanderthals, replacing their earlier Y chromosomes and mitochondria while leaving most of their genome intact. The probability of such replacement happening independently for both maternal and paternal lineages is low, but not impossible. Some scientists invoke natural selection to explain it, suggesting that modern human versions of these elements conferred advantages that spread rapidly once introduced. Still, it remains one of the many puzzles that resist a single, clean answer. These puzzles led Harvard geneticist David Reich to compare our models to Ptolemaic astronomy. In antiquity, astronomers who assumed the Earth sat at the centre of the cosmos explained planetary motion by adding epicycles, small loops within larger orbits, to force the model to fit observations. In a similar way, geneticists have repeatedly patched the human story with mixture events, back migrations, and selective sweeps to account for anomalies. Each new genome requires a new adjustment. The danger is that the model becomes a patchwork of explanations that fit data, but may obscure a deeper, simpler truth yet to be recognised. One alternative Reich and others have entertained is that the divisions between modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, were not as sharp as we often assume. Perhaps Neanderthals carried far more ancestry from Homo sapiens-like groups than the standard 3 to 5% usually cited. Perhaps the proportion was as high as 30, or even 50%, making them closer to us than to Denisovans. In that case, the labels archaic and modern lose much of their meaning. Neanderthals may have been as entitled to the name Homo sapiens as we are. Another complication emerges from Africa itself. For a long time, our species story has been told with Africa at the centre, but with surprisingly little direct genetic evidence from deep African prehistory. Ancient DNA preservation in Africa is poor compared to Europe or Siberia, leaving us with a patchier record. Yet analysis of living populations reveals astonishingly deep divisions. Groups such as the San in southern Africa carry lineages that diverge from other humans more than 200,000 years ago. Within Africa, substructure was as profound as that between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, with multiple semi-isolated populations coexisting and mixing at different times. This paints a picture of Africa not as a single cradle, but as a continent filled with semi-independent human populations, each evolving along its own trajectory, occasionally reconnecting. Some may have contributed to our ancestry, others left no trace. The continent was not a uniform homeland, but a shifting archipelago of small, semi-isolated groups. Genetic diversity was preserved not within any single group, but across the ensemble, like an ecosystem sustained by many fragile populations. The survival of our species required periodic merging to recharge diversity that would otherwise have been lost. If this was the case, the very categories of archaic and modern collapse into something more fluid. Were the groups in Africa 300,000 years ago modern humans, archaic humans, or something in between? The answer may be all of the above. Our distinctions reflect the fossils we have and the genetic samples we can recover, but the reality was likely one of shifting boundaries. The African lineage that eventually expanded across the world was only one among many. The uncertainty is humbling. For all our advances in ancient DNA, we cannot yet explain the mechanisms that truly made our lineage distinct. Genes can tell us about ancestry, about who mixed with whom and when, but they struggle to reveal what made one group capable of expanding across continents while others faded. Epigenetic studies provide tantalizing hints. By studying chemical modifications preserved in ancient DNA, scientists have reconstructed which genes were more or less active in Neanderthals compared to Homo sapiens. One striking signal involves the vocal tract. Genes regulating the larynx and pharynx appear to have been differently expressed in our lineage, potentially shaping the capacity for articulate speech. This may point to changes invisible in bone but profound in their impact on communication. Still, these findings raise as many questions as they answer. Did Neanderthals speak? Almost certainly, though perhaps not with the same range of sounds. Did cultural innovation drive genetic change? Or did genetic tweaks allow cultural leaps? We do not know. What is clear is that our genome is not a simple code but a palimpsest of ancient encounters. It records not just separation but repeated reunion, not just divergence but a continual remixing across landscapes. When we look back between 500,000 and 200,000 years ago, we are staring into a genetic fog. Outlines emerge, then blur. Lineages split, then reconnect. The neat diagrams we draw are provisional, and the truth is likely stranger than we have yet imagined. The haunting question is not only who we are descended from, but whether such categories even make sense. Perhaps we're all mosaics, each carrying pieces of lineages that once seemed distinct. If that is true, then our family tree is less a tree and more a web woven in darkness, a web we're only beginning to trace strand by strand. Were modern humans already scattered, waiting for a spark? When we look back at Africa between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, we do not see a single homeland with a single population. Instead, we find an archipelago of small groups, each isolated, each fragile, and each carrying only a fraction of the genetic diversity that together would define our species. It was not a continent unified under one ancestral flag, but a patchwork of local experiments, with survival constantly at risk. Genetic studies of living Africans show this story most clearly. The greatest diversity of human lineages today is found not in Europe, not in Asia, but within Africa itself. This diversity cannot be explained unless we imagine deep separations within the continent during this period. Populations diverge for tens of thousands of years at a time, cut off by deserts, forests, or climatic shifts that rendered regions impassable. When a few of these groups came back into contact, their genes recombined, restoring variation that would otherwise have been lost forever. The species was maintained not by one large thriving population, but by the occasional merging of these fragile branches. Imagine Africa at this time not as a stable cradle, but as a trellis, a latticework of human lines. Each line represents a small community, perhaps only hundreds or a few thousand people spread thin across landscapes of shifting rainfall and unpredictable resources. Most of these groups would have seemed isolated to each other, unlikely to exchange mates more than rarely. If they remained apart too long, their genetic diversity would shrink, leading eventually to extinction. But when climate shifted, or a corridor opened between regions, they met, and their diversity was replenished. This helps explain a paradox. By the late Pleistocene, Africa contained the richest human genetic diversity of any continent. Yet many of the groups we can now trace through ancient genomes or the echoes in living people were astonishingly small. Small groups should lose variation through drift, becoming increasingly inbred and fragile. The only way the diversity could survive was through periodic fusion, a recycling of lineages across the continent. The evidence for this comes not just from DNA but from fossils. Sites as far apart as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, and Florisbad in South Africa preserve faces and skulls that are recognisably human but subtly different. Some have elongated crania, some broad faces, some robust jaws. No single fossil looks like the prototype of our species. Instead, each seems to represent a regional variant, a population contributing to the whole mosaic. There was no one birthplace. The origin of Homo sapiens was a braided process across an entire continent. One striking study examined hunter-gatherers living in eastern and central Africa as recently as 15,000 years ago. Their DNA showed clear signs of long-term isolation, with each group only a few hundred strong. Extrapolating backward, scientists suggest that the situation must have been even more extreme, between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago. Picture Africa dotted with tiny camps, each preserving its own traditions, each losing genetic diversity year after year, until occasional contact restored it. This reality challenges the classic picture of a single founding population radiating outward. Instead, the trellis model suggests that our species survived because of its multiplicity. Each group was vulnerable, but together, through the rare exchange of genes and ideas, the species endured. Without this occasional reweaving, Homo sapiens might have fractured into dead ends like so many of our cousins. Archaeology supports this view with subtle hints. Stone tools from different regions of Africa during this period vary widely in form. Some groups favoured large hand axes, others smaller flake-based tools. The differences suggest cultural boundaries, perhaps reinforced by geographic ones. Yet at times these styles appear to leap across regions, as if carried by people moving between groups. Just as genes were exchanged, so too were ideas, creating a patchwork of traditions that rarely stabilised. Climate must have played a decisive role in this pattern. Africa between 200 and 100,000 years ago experienced oscillations of wet and dry, driven by the rhythms of ice ages and monsoon shifts. In wet phases, grasslands expanded, rivers flowed, and corridors opened between regions. In dry phases, deserts advanced, forests shrank, and groups became trapped in shrinking refuges. These cycles repeatedly divided and rejoined populations, leaving their imprint in our genomes today. The result was not a linear path toward modern humans, but a braided one. Some lineages contributed more, others less. Some may have vanished completely, leaving no trace. What unites them is not their isolation, but their role in a larger system. The trellis held because of its many strands, not despite them. This understanding humbles the idea of a single Eden or chosen group. We are the descendants not of one triumphant population, but of many precarious ones. Each community, no matter how small, carried a part of the legacy that would later expand. Without the archipelago, there would be no continuity. Without the trellis, there would be no species. It raises a haunting question. How many other groups lived in Africa during this time, never merging, never leaving descendants in us? Fossils are scarce, genomes even scarcer. There may have been dozens of human populations across the continent, experimenting with survival, vanishing without record. Our species is the survivor not of a single battle, but of a long, silent lottery of merging and extinction. When we look at our faces in the mirror, we see the composite of many such groups. Our DNA carries whispers of people scattered across ancient Africa, people who never knew each other, people who lived and died in isolation yet somehow became part of a species-wide chorus. The story of 200,000 to 100,000 years ago is not one of triumph, but of tenuous persistence, a fragile trellis of humans waiting for the conditions that would one day allow a breakout. Why does the Levant keep appearing as a meeting place? Again and again across deep time, this narrow strip of land between Africa and Eurasia has been the stage for encounters that changed human history. To understand why, we need to think less in terms of people and more in terms of landscapes, climate, and the movements of animals. For most of prehistory, humans were simply another migratory species, moving with the rains and the herds, constrained by the same corridors as gazelles or elephants. The Near East sits at the junction of continents, a bottleneck where two vast ecological worlds connect. It is here, in caves and river valleys that bridge Africa and Eurasia, that humans of many kinds repeatedly crossed paths. The geography of the Levant explains much of this. On one side lies Africa, with its savannas and deserts, pulsing with wet and dry cycles that shifted every few tens of thousands of years. On the other side lies Western Asia and Europe, lands shaped by glacial advances and retreats, where ice pushed southward and then receded, reshaping ecosystems again and again. The Levant sits between, a narrow corridor that remained habitable even when conditions elsewhere became harsh. The Mediterranean climate provided reliable rainfall, with river systems and coastal plains that offered resources year after year. It was never as lush as Africa's tropical regions, nor as cold as glacial Europe. That middle ground made it a refuge, a staging point, and a passage. Animal remains from Levantine sites reveal the same story of flux. In some layers we find African fauna, hippopotamuses, giraffes, and hartebeest, species that would have wandered north during wet phases when the Sahara was green. In other layers we see steppe species from Eurasia, horses, aurochs, and deer, moving south during cooler phases when grasslands expanded. The Levant was a seasonal crossroad of life, with waves of animals moving through, pursued by waves of human hunters. Each climatic oscillation brought new opportunities and new pressures, ensuring that no human group could remain alone for long. Archaeology preserves snapshots of these encounters. At Kesem Cave in Israel, around 400,000 years ago, hominins used fire and butchered animals with flint blades. The people of Kesem were not modern humans, but perhaps descendants of earlier Homo erectus or transitional species. Yet their presence demonstrates how long the Levant served as a stable ecological niche. Hundreds of thousands of years later, in caves like Skul and Kafse, we find burials of humans with anatomies close to our own, dating to roughly 120,000 years ago. In the same region, only tens of thousands of years earlier and later, Neanderthals also left their bones. These alternating presences suggest that the Levant was not held by one group for long, but was repeatedly contested, abandoned, and reoccupied as climates shifted. The most striking evidence of the Levant as a meeting ground comes from genetic and fossil clues of contact between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. By around 120,000 years ago, early modern humans had reached the region, as seen in the fossils at Skul and Kafse. Yet Neanderthals were present both before and after this window. Later, in caves such as Kibara and Amud, Neanderthal skeletons show a deep presence in the same landscapes. The overlap suggests that these groups may have encountered each other here, long before the larger expansions of modern humans into Eurasia. DNA confirms that some of the earliest mixing events between our lineage and Neanderthals likely occurred in this corridor, with traces found in every non-African genome today. The Levant was not just a passage of stone tools and animal herds, but of genes. Why here, and not elsewhere? Part of the answer lies in the fragility of other routes. To the west, the Sahara acted as a barrier for much of this time, expanding into an ocean of sand during dry phases. To the east, the Arabian Peninsula alternated between fertile savannas and arid deserts, opening and closing as a corridor. But the Levant, with its rivers flowing from the Jordan Valley and its proximity to the Mediterranean coast, remained habitable even during harsh intervals. It was a bottleneck, but not a dead end. Whoever passed through left their traces in caves sheltered from the elements, creating a continuity of evidence unmatched in most of the ancient world. The Levant's role as doorway is reinforced by its position in the faunal record. Paleoecologists note that during wet periods, the Nile corridor funneled African species northward. During dry periods, steppe animals from the north funneled southward. Human populations followed the same rhythms. Each time the doorway opened, it allowed a new experiment in human dispersal. Sometimes those experiments failed, with groups retreating or vanishing. Sometimes they left genetic legacies that still live on, but in every case the Levant was the testing ground. We should not imagine this corridor as empty wilderness. The evidence of fire use, stone tool traditions, and intentional burials suggests that hominins lived here in structured ways. They adapted to hunting local species, to managing resources in predictable landscapes. Caves were occupied again and again, sometimes over spans of hundreds of thousands of years. Each wave of people would have left hearths, tools and bones layered above those of the last. To stand in such a cave today is to see a literal cross-section of human history, stacked one layer atop another, each layer telling of arrivals, departures and returns. What these encounters meant socially is harder to know. Did Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens compete for the same prey? Did they avoid each other, or did they sometimes exchange individuals? Fossils suggest both possibilities. At times, modern humans seem to vanish from the record, with Neanderthals reappearing in their place. At other times, modern-like features in Neanderthal remains hint at gene flow. The Levant may have hosted a dance of coexistence, with groups shifting dominance as climates and populations shifted. The broader significance of this region lies in its continuity. From 400,000 to 100,000 years ago, the Levant kept serving as a passage. When climates were favourable, people crossed. When conditions collapsed elsewhere, the Levant endured as a refuge. This repeating role makes it central to any history of humanity. Without the Levant, Africa and Eurasia would have been isolated experiments. With it, they were connected worlds. And yet, for all this evidence, much remains uncertain. Did the groups at Sesam Cave belong to a direct line leading to Neanderthals, or were they a dead-end population? Were the burials at Skul and Kafse part of a sustained expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa, or were they an early pulse that later died out? How many times did our species cross this threshold before the final breakout? We do not know. What we can say is that the Levant was the doorway through which such attempts passed, whether they succeeded or failed. The haunting question is whether our story would look the same without this narrow corridor. If the Levant had been less hospitable, If deserts had stretched unbroken from the Nile to the Euphrates, would our line ever have reached beyond Africa? Perhaps the survival of our global species hinged on the geography of a strip of land no wider than a few hundred kilometres. The Levant was not destiny, but it was opportunity. Again and again that opportunity was taken, lost, and taken again. Why do Neanderthals carry traces of us? The expectation for decades was that Neanderthals and modern humans were two distinct species, diverging from a common ancestor and then pursuing separate evolutionary paths. Yet, as ancient genomes have been read more closely, an unexpected truth has emerged. Some of the very earliest evidence of interbreeding goes not from Neanderthals into us, but from our lineage into them. In other words, the Neanderthal genome contains a signature of borrowed DNA from humans who looked far more like us than like them. The story begins with a puzzling observation. When geneticists sequenced Neanderthal genomes, they compared the different compartments of DNA. The autosomal chromosomes, which carry most of the genome, suggested a divergence from Homo sapiens roughly 600,000 years ago. But the mitochondrial DNA passed only through the maternal line, and the Y chromosome passed through the paternal line told a different story. They looked far younger, only 300,000 to 400,000 years old. How could one part of the genome suggest a deep split, while other parts looked as though they had been replaced much later? The simplest explanation is gene flow. At some point between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, a population related to modern humans moved out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals. They did not overwhelm or replace them, but they contributed genes. Over time, those contributions spread through Neanderthal populations until they became fixed. The result was that all later Neanderthals carried Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA that traced back not to their own deep ancestors, but to these intrusive modern human-like donors. There are two main models for how this happened. The first is the small trickle model. In this view, occasional contacts between early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals introduced a small number of lineages, which then spread by chance or by selective advantage. The second is the big wave model, which suggests a more substantial population movement that brought many individuals into Neanderthal territory, interbreeding on a scale large enough to reshape entire lineages. Which is right remains unresolved, and the truth may involve elements of both. What gives weight to these models is the way natural selection works on small populations. Neanderthals were spread thinly across Eurasia, living in groups rarely numbering more than a few thousand. In such contexts, if an incoming Y chromosome or mitochondrial lineage provided even a slight advantage, it could sweep through the population in only a few thousand years. One possible advantage might have been immune genes better adapted to pathogens encountered from Africa. Another possibility is that these lineages simply arrived at the right time, when Neanderthal populations were at low numbers, allowing replacement by demographic chance. Archaeological evidence supports the plausibility of such encounters. In the Levant and perhaps elsewhere in Eurasia, fossils hint at the presence of early Homo sapiens long before their final expansion. At sites like Mislia Cave in Israel, remains dated to around 180,000 years ago show features of our lineage. These early migrants may not have persisted in the region, but they could easily have left behind genetic traces in Neanderthal populations living nearby. The fossils and the genomes converge on the idea that our ancestors were moving outward from Africa in pulses long before the great dispersal of 70,000 years ago. The genetic imprint itself is subtle, but unmistakable. When researchers reconstructed the Neanderthal Y chromosome, they found it carried sequences much closer to modern humans than to Denisovans. Likewise, the mitochondrial DNA of Neanderthals fell within the variation of early Homo sapiens, not outside it. These are not the signals of independent evolution, but of replacement. The Neanderthal genome, in this sense, was already hybridized long before modern humans spread widely. What this means for how we think about species boundaries is profound. If Neanderthals already carried a portion of our DNA hundreds of thousands of years ago, then the sharp line between them and us was blurred almost from the beginning. They were not a wholly separate lineage evolving in isolation, but part of a network of populations exchanging genes over vast spans of time. In a sense, the Neanderthals we know from later fossils were already a mixture of older Eurasian ancestry and contributions from Homo sapiens-like groups. The scale of this borrowing raises questions we cannot yet answer. Was it a single event, a brief period when populations overlapped and interbred, leaving a genetic legacy that endured? Or was it a repeated process with small groups of humans entering Neanderthal ranges again and again over hundreds of thousands of years? The patchiness of the fossil record makes it difficult to choose. Each discovery of a new site, each new genome, seems to add another twist. We should be cautious not to overinterpret. The genetic contribution from these early Homo sapiens into Neanderthals was not enormous compared to their overall genome. Most of the Neanderthal genetic makeup remained distinct. But the fact that we can see this signal at all, despite hundreds of thousands of years of subsequent evolution, means it was significant. It shaped their lineage in ways we still do not fully understand. The haunting question is what these meetings were like. Did small bands of humans and Neanderthals recognize each other as kin, close enough to mate and raise offspring? Were these unions cooperative, or were they forced? We cannot know. The DNA tells us only that children were born and their lineages survived. The social and emotional worlds behind those events are hidden, perhaps forever. Why do Neanderthals carry traces of us? Because the boundaries between human groups were never absolute. Between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, our ancestors were already leaving Africa in pulses, already meeting other humans, already leaving genetic fingerprints. Neanderthals borrowed from us before we ever borrowed from them. Their story, like ours, is one of mixture, of blurred lines, of identities woven together in deep time. If Neanderthals had brains as big as ours, why did they not spread across the planet in the same way? For a long time, the story of human uniqueness rested comfortably on the assumption that our brains were simply bigger and therefore more capable. That assumption is no longer defensible. Fossil skulls show clearly that by 300,000 years ago, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia had brain volumes at least as large as Homo sapiens, and in some cases larger. Their cranial capacities often exceeded 1,600 cubic centimetres, putting them at the top end of human variation today. Our brains were not exceptional in size. If size alone guaranteed dominance, the Neanderthals would have been the conquerors. The fact that they were not forces us to look for subtler explanations. One possibility is that while Neanderthal brains were large, they were organised differently. The shape of their skulls suggests elongated crania, with relatively less expansion in the parietal and temporal lobes compared to the globular crania of modern humans. Brain shape affects how neural circuits are arranged, and globularity in Homo sapiens is often associated with expanded parietal regions, involved in integrating vision, movement, and planning. Yet such associations are tentative. Brains do not fossilise, and what we can infer from endocasts and skulls remains indirect. Epigenetic studies offer another line of insight. Researchers have compared patterns of DNA methylation in ancient genomes, chemical marks that regulate how genes are expressed. These methylation patterns suggest that genes involved in the larynx, pharynx, and other parts of the vocal tract were differently regulated in Neanderthals compared to Homo sapiens. In other words, while the skeletal apparatus for speech was broadly similar, the control of those structures may have diverged. This difference could have affected the range of sounds produced or the precision of articulation. Even small differences in vocal control can matter when complex language is involved. Language itself may have been the critical threshold, not symbolic expression in art or ornament, which appeared much later, but the capacity to combine sounds into structured sequences and to convey abstract concepts. Neanderthals almost certainly had some form of communication. They hunted cooperatively, used fire, and passed down knowledge of tool-making across generations. Such behaviours would have been impossible without shared signals and meanings. But was their system of communication as flexible and generative as ours? Could they tell stories about things not present, pass along myths, or coordinate strategies for the future? That remains unknown. The comparison is humbling. If we picture Neanderthals as silent or inarticulate, we are almost certainly wrong. Yet if we picture them as possessing fully modern language, we may be wrong too. The truth lies somewhere in between. The epigenetic hints of altered vocal tract regulation suggest that their speech capacity may have been different in quality rather than in presence or absence. That difference, however slight, may have influenced how knowledge was transmitted and accumulated over time. Another possibility is that the issue was not with speech, but with social networks. Large brains are energetically expensive, consuming up to 20% of our resting metabolism. One evolutionary explanation is that they pay for themselves by allowing larger and more complex social groups. Neanderthals lived in small, dispersed populations, often separated by vast distances. Genetic studies show low diversity, consistent with long-term small group sizes. Homo sapiens, by contrast, may have developed ways of linking groups into wider networks, exchanging mates, tools, and ideas across distances. If so, the breakthrough was not inside the skull, but between them, the wiring of societies rather than of neurons. Ecology may also explain why large brains did not guarantee Neanderthal expansion. They were highly specialised to Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, adapted to cold climates and to hunting large mammals. That specialisation served them well for hundreds of thousands of years, but it may have made them less flexible when climates shifted. Homo sapiens, with similar brain size but perhaps greater social connectivity and flexibility, were better able to exploit diverse environments, from coasts to savannas to forests. It is important to stress that none of this diminishes Neanderthals as humans. They controlled fire, crafted sophisticated stone tools, buried their dead, and survived harsh glacial cycles that would have challenged any species. Their intelligence was formidable. The mystery is not why they were less advanced, but why their trajectory diverged from ours. Big brains did not guarantee a breakthrough into global expansion. Something else mattered, and we are only beginning to identify what that something might be. The haunting question remains: how many other big-brained experiments in humanity existed without ever breaking through? Denisovans too had brains likely comparable in size. Homo heidelbergensis before them left behind stone tools and hunting evidence. Even Homo floresiensis, with a brain far smaller, managed to persist on an island for tens of thousands of years. Brain size alone was never destiny. Our story depended on a confluence of anatomy, language, social networks, and chance. So if Neanderthals had brains as big as ours, why did they not spread across the world? The most honest answer is that we do not know. It may be that they did not need to. For hundreds of thousands of years they thrived in their environments, with no pressure to expand further. It may be that subtle differences in communication limited their ability to scale up culture across generations. Or it may be that their fate was sealed not by deficiencies but by bad luck, by small population size, and by the sheer contingency of survival. Big brains were necessary for our expansion, but they were not sufficient. Intelligence alone does not explain why one lineage of humans spread to every continent, while others remained local. The breakthrough was not simply cranial volume. It was the emergence of something more elusive, a way of turning brains into culture, culture into survival, and survival into momentum. That spark remains difficult to pin down, but its absence in other lineages reminds us that human history was never guaranteed. How do you keep knowledge alive when a storm kills your elders? The survival of a species is not only about anatomy or genetics. It also depends on memory, the fragile thread of skills and practices carried from one generation to the next. Between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens lived not as vast populations connected across continents, but as scattered bands across Africa and occasionally into adjacent regions. Each band was a small island of knowledge, like a fragile archipelago of ideas. The risk was that when people died, their knowledge died with them. Archaeologists studying this period often emphasize the precarious scale of these groups. A band might number only a few dozen individuals. At times of abundance, they might link with neighbouring bands to form loose communities, but when drought struck or resources shrank, they broke apart again. Such small numbers meant that every elder mattered. One skilled napper of stone tools, one hunter who knew the migration of herds, one woman who carried the recipe for processing a toxic tuber into food. If she died unexpectedly, that knowledge could vanish from a group forever. This fragility is not just theory. Modern examples show how knowledge can be lost when populations are too small. On the island of Tasmania, Separated from mainland Australia for thousands of years, indigenous populations gradually lost some technologies known to their ancestors, such as bone tools and fishing techniques. The cause was not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of critical mass. When groups are small and isolated, the chain of transmission can break. A storm can drown the only canoe maker, and no one remains who knows the craft. The same principle must have haunted early Homo sapiens in Africa. Stone tool traditions provide hints of this dynamic. Across Africa in this period we see waves of innovation, new forms of blades, points, and prepared core technologies. Yet these appear, spread briefly, and then disappear, sometimes reappearing thousands of years later. This on-again, off-again record suggests not a steady accumulation of progress, but a fragile process, with inventions lost as easily as they were gained. A technique might arise in one group and spread to neighbours, but if drought scattered those people or disease struck, the technique could vanish entirely, leaving only stone fragments as ghostly testimony. The idea of a critical mass of information is important here. To preserve complex knowledge, a society needs enough individuals practicing and transmitting it. In large populations, redundancy ensures survival. If one master dies, others carry on. In tiny bands, there is no redundancy. A generation gap can erase skills in a single season. This bottleneck of culture is as real as any genetic bottleneck, and it helps explain why human cultural development during this period looks so intermittent. The species had the brains to innovate, but the social fabric was too thin to guarantee continuity. Climate added to this instability. Between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago, Africa experienced repeated swings of wet and dry phases. Wet periods allowed populations to grow, expand, and connect, creating conditions where knowledge could spread. Dry phases shrank habitats, forcing groups into refuges where they became isolated again. Each cycle risked breaking the chains of transmission. A tool style might flourish during a wet phase, only to disappear in the next drought when its practitioners scattered or died. What kinds of knowledge were at stake? Beyond tools, there were skills of fire management, plant processing, hunting strategies, and navigation of landscapes. Many of these cannot be directly traced in the archaeological record, but we can infer them from the survival of small groups in difficult environments. People had to know which roots were edible, how to detoxify seeds, when to expect the rains, and where animals crossed rivers. These were not optional skills. They were the difference between life and death. Yet each of them depended on memory, passed from elders to the young in fragile threads of oral instruction and practice. The evidence from sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave in South Africa hints at moments when these threads thickened. Here we see early use of ochre, perhaps for symbolic purposes, as well as advanced stone blade production dating back more than 100,000 years. But even here, continuity is not clear. After flourishing for a time, some of these practices seem to fade from the record. They may have survived in pockets, but not across the species as a whole. Once again, we are reminded of fragility, of culture as a flame that had to be sheltered against the wind. This perspective changes how we view our ancestors. They were not steadily marching toward progress. They were struggling to hold on to the fragile gains of each generation. We often assume that once a tool or technique is invented, it is never forgotten. The archaeological record shows otherwise. Entire traditions could vanish, erased by the contingencies of small populations and harsh environments. The progress that looks so inevitable in hindsight was in reality a precarious stop-and-start process. It is humbling to imagine how many ideas may have been lost, how many ways of shaping stone, weaving fibres, curing hides, or hunting animals were discovered and forgotten in those long millennia. How many myths and songs disappeared with the last elder of a band? Our species may have been a crucible of constant creativity, but without the population size to sustain it, much of that creativity evaporated. The haunting question is what would have happened if the archipelago had been larger, if populations had been more connected across Africa? Would cultural accumulation have started earlier? Would complex societies have appeared long before 70,000 years ago? Or was the very fragility of this archipelago a necessary filter, a crucible that shaped us into what we later became? How do you keep knowledge alive when a storm kills your elders? The answer in those deep millennia was that often you did not. Knowledge was lost, rediscovered, reshaped, and lost again. Humanity lived in a fragile archipelago of ideas, with memory as precarious as life itself. Only later would the archipelago begin to weave into something more continuous, but for 200,000 years, our ancestors lived with the constant possibility that the fire of culture would go out with the death of a single person. Why did some human expansions vanish like sparks in rain? For much of prehistory, Homo sapiens was not a conquering force, but a tentative presence. Our ancestors ventured outward from Africa multiple times, long before the dispersal that would eventually succeed. These early expansions left behind fossils, stone tools, and even genetic echoes, yet they did not endure. They are best imagined not as fires spreading uncontrollably, but as sparks, brief flashes of presence in Eurasia that glowed for a moment and then went out, erased by climate, competition, or isolation. The clearest evidence comes from the Levant, that narrow land between Africa and Asia that served as a repeated gateway. At the caves of Skul and Kafse in present-day Israel, fossils of humans with anatomically modern traits have been dated to between 120 and 100,000 years ago. They were tall, with rounded skulls and faces strikingly similar to our own. Some were buried intentionally, with grave goods such as deer antlers placed alongside their bodies. For decades these finds raised a puzzle. What were modern-looking humans doing in the Levant tens of thousands of years before the major dispersal? The answer appears to be that they represented an early expansion out of Africa, a spark that reached into Eurasia but did not spread further. Genetic studies confirm that these early wanderers left no direct descendants among living non-Africans. The DNA of present-day populations outside Africa derives almost entirely from a later expansion, not from these first attempts. Whatever promise these early pioneers held, their lineages were extinguished. Whether they died out locally, were absorbed into Neanderthal populations, or retreated south again into Africa, their story ended without continuity. Farther east, hints of other sparks appear. At Mislia Cave, also in Israel, a modern human jaw dated to around 180,000 years ago extends the timeline of these failed expansions even deeper. This suggests that Homo sapiens may have ventured into Eurasia multiple times, not just once. Each time they appear in the record and then disappear. The repeated pattern is one of bold movement followed by vanishing. In Arabia, stone tool assemblages point to human presence during wet phases of the climate. When monsoon rains pushed northward, the deserts bloomed into grasslands, dotted with lakes and rivers. Fossil lake beds in places like Saudi Arabia preserve evidence of human activity dating to around 100,000 years ago. Yet these favourable conditions were temporary. When the rains retreated, the deserts returned, cutting off populations from each other and from Africa. Archaeologists see human presence in Arabia as a pulse. People arrived, thrived for a short period, and then vanished when the climate closed the door. Even farther afield, skeletal hints in China and Southeast Asia have been interpreted by some as evidence of early Homo sapiens. Fossils from Daoxian and Fuyan Cave in southern China, dated to around 120,000 years ago, show dental features closer to modern humans than to archaic populations. These remain controversial, as dating methods are complex and the fossil record incomplete. If correct, they would suggest that humans penetrated deep into Asia far earlier than once thought, only to vanish again. Why did these sparks fail to ignite? Climate was a major factor. Between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, Earth entered marine isotope stage 4, a period of global cooling and aridification. Deserts expanded in North Africa and Arabia, cutting off corridors that had briefly opened. In Europe and Western Asia, glacial conditions grew harsher, favouring Neanderthals who were adapted to the cold. The habitats that had allowed early Homo sapiens to move outward collapsed, isolating or extinguishing the groups that had ventured too far. Another factor was competition. Neanderthals had already established themselves across Europe and much of Western Asia. Denisovans occupied parts of Asia farther east. These populations were not passive. They had their own adaptations, technologies, and territories. Early Homo sapiens entering these regions would have faced not only environmental challenges but also rival humans. In small numbers and without overwhelming advantages, they may have been absorbed or excluded. The fragility of cultural transmission in small groups also played a role. A handful of bands moving into new regions carried with them the knowledge of survival from their homelands, but when isolated, they may have lacked the critical mass to maintain or adapt that knowledge to new environments. A technique for hunting savanna animals might fail in forests or mountains. Without enough exchange of ideas across groups, innovation stalled and survival chances shrank. For archaeologists and geneticists today, these vanished expansions are a reminder that the human story is not one of inevitability. For every success, there were multiple failures. The school and Kafsa people lived and died without knowing that their kind would one day circle the globe. The humans at Mislia Cave may have been part of a wave that left no genetic trace. The toolmakers in Arabia may have seen their lakes vanish, leaving them stranded in deserts. The possible pioneers in China may have disappeared so completely that only teeth remain to suggest they were ever there. The haunting question is how many more sparks were struck and extinguished without leaving any trace at all. For every fossil we recover, how many others lie buried, or eroded, or never preserved? The record we have is incomplete, a biased sample of what once existed. The true number of expansions and vanishings may be far greater than we know. Why did some human expansions vanish like sparks in rain? Because the conditions of survival were unforgiving, and because small groups cannot always sustain themselves against climate, competition and chance. For 30,000 years before the final breakout, Homo sapiens was a species of fragile ventures, probing the world beyond Africa, only to retreat or perish. Their stories remind us that our eventual success was not destiny, but the result of many failures that came before. What changed here, and why now? For more than 100,000 years before this moment, our species had already stepped beyond Africa multiple times. Each attempt had flickered briefly in caves and lake beds across Eurasia and Arabia, only to vanish like sparks in rain. Then, around 70,000 years ago, one of those sparks caught. A small group of Homo sapiens crossed the ecological thresholds out of Africa, and, for the first time, succeeded in establishing a lasting presence beyond the continent of their birth. This was the breakout, the one that endured, the one that ultimately led to our presence across the planet. The mystery lies not in whether it happened, but in why this moment was different from all the rest. The archaeological and genetic evidence both point to a tiny founder population. Genetic diversity among living humans outside Africa is a narrow subset of the richness found within Africa. That narrowing is most parsimoniously explained by a small group, probably numbering in the low thousands at most, moving outward and becoming the ancestors of all non-Africans alive today. This is not to say that other expansions never happened. We know they did. But this was the one that persisted, multiplying until it reshaped the demographics of the entire world. Where exactly this breakout began remains debated. One hypothesis emphasizes the Nile Valley. During certain climatic windows, the Sahara retreated and the Nile became a lush corridor connecting sub-Saharan Africa with the Levant. Populations moving along this river system could have reached the eastern Mediterranean and then crossed into the Levantine corridor, continuing into Western Asia. Fossils in the region demonstrate that Homo sapiens were already present there long before 70,000 years ago, so this route has strong precedent. Another hypothesis focuses on the Arabian Peninsula. During wetter phases, Arabia transformed into a land of grasslands and lakes, as revealed by fossil riverbeds and stone tools scattered across the desert today. Populations could have moved along the southern edge of the Red Sea, crossing at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait where the distance narrows to less than 30 kilometres. From there, they could expand into Arabia and beyond. The appeal of this southern route lies in genetic models suggesting rapid dispersal into South Asia soon after the breakout. Arabia offers a plausible stepping stone. A third possibility is that both routes were used at different times. The truth may not be a single path, but multiple doorways, each opening and closing as climates shifted. The Nile corridor may have been passable during one wet phase, the Arabian Peninsula during another. What matters is that one of these corridors remained open long enough, and that the small groups who crossed were able to establish themselves without vanishing as earlier pioneers had done. Why now, after so many failed expansions, did one finally succeed? Climate may have provided part of the answer. Around 70,000 years ago, environmental conditions shifted again, with corridors through Arabia and the Levant becoming more favourable. Lakes and rivers appeared in places that are deserts today, offering water and resources for migrating bands. These conditions may have created a window of opportunity that had been absent during harsher intervals. Demography may have played a role too. Within Africa, populations had grown and diversified, weaving together a trellis of groups across the continent. This provided a reservoir of genetic variation that could fuel resilience in new environments. When a small group left, they carried with them not only the genes but also the cultural practices of a wider African network. Even if their numbers were small, their toolkit of knowledge may have been more robust than earlier pioneers who ventured out during leaner times. Archaeological hints suggest that technological capacities were also shifting. Blade-based stone tools, hefted points, and perhaps more effective use of fire appear in African sites before this breakout. While we should be cautious not to romanticize these as sudden revolutions, they suggest incremental improvements in survival strategies. The groups that left around 70,000 years ago may have been slightly better equipped to handle diverse ecologies than their predecessors. Small changes can make the difference between a failed spark and a sustainable flame. Still, we should resist the temptation to frame this moment as destiny. It was contingent. A handful of bands moved outward, and through a mixture of climate, chance, and persistence, they managed not only to survive but to grow. Had the rains failed a little sooner, had disease struck at the wrong moment, had they met stronger resistance from other human populations, the breakout might have failed just as earlier ones did. Our global presence today rests on contingencies layered atop contingencies. The bottleneck these groups represent is still visible in our DNA. Non-African populations today share signals of reduced genetic diversity, consistent with a founding group that was small enough to carry only part of the African genetic palette. This reduction has left traces in our health, our susceptibility to disease, and the subtle ways our genomes differ across continents. Every non-African alive today is a descendant of that narrow passage. What changed here, and why now? Perhaps nothing more than timing. Perhaps Homo sapiens had already tried the doorways many times, and finally one attempt happened to coincide with favourable climates, sufficient cultural resilience, and enough luck to persist. If so, the breakout was not a dramatic leap forward in intelligence or ability, but simply the one attempt that did not collapse. The haunting question is how fragile this success truly was. How close did humanity come to another failed expansion, to vanishing outside Africa once again? Was there a single moment, a single crossing of a river or a narrow strait, when the survival of all future non-Africans hinged on the fate of a few dozen people? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that around 70,000 years ago the breakout began, and this time the spark did not fade. What happens when two intelligent species meet? By 60,000 years ago, the first waves of Homo sapiens moving beyond Africa had spread through the corridors of Arabia, across the Levant, and farther still into Eurasia. To the north and west lay populations who had occupied these regions for hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals. They were not strangers to the land. They had mastered glacial Europe, adapted to Ice Age steppes, and thrived in environments that tested the endurance of any human lineage. When modern humans arrived, they did not find empty landscapes. They found another kind of human waiting. For decades, scientists debated whether these encounters happened at all. The prevailing view into the late 20th century was that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had little or no interaction, that they were separate species divided by cognition, culture, or even biology. The idea of interbreeding was dismissed as unlikely. Then came the sequencing of Neanderthal genomes in the early 21st century. The surprise was immediate and profound. Every non-African person alive today carries a few % of Neanderthal DNA. The conclusion was unavoidable. These encounters were not only real, they were intimate. The most striking evidence comes from fossils dated to this very window, 60 to 50,000 years ago. At sites in Siberia and Eastern Europe, genomes from early Homo sapiens reveal recent Neanderthal ancestry. In some cases, the Neanderthal contribution is so fresh that it must have come from an ancestor only 6 or 7 generations back. One individual from Romania, known as OACE1, carried large stretches of Neanderthal DNA in his genome, consistent with a Neanderthal great-great-grandparent. These were not distant admixture events lost in deep time. They were encounters within living memory. Such findings force us to imagine these meetings at a human scale. Small bands of Homo sapiens moving into new territories would have encountered Neanderthal groups already established there. The first impressions would have been uncanny. Here were beings who looked different, broader faces, heavy brows, stockier builds, but who also walked upright, used fire, hunted in groups, and likely spoke in ways not unlike our own. To meet a Neanderthal was not to confront an animal, but to meet another kind of person. What followed from such recognition is harder to know. Archaeology provides little clarity on the social nature of these encounters. Were they hostile, cooperative, or both? Did groups exchange mates willingly, or were unions forced? The genetic evidence can tell us only that children were born and survived to reproduce. The social contexts of those births are hidden behind tens of thousands of years of silence. Yet the persistence of Neanderthal DNA suggests that whatever the circumstances, these encounters were repeated and widespread enough to leave a legacy across all non-African humans today. The timing of this mixture fits closely with the first movements of Homo sapiens into Eurasia. As soon as our lineage left Africa in a sustained way, it seems, they met Neanderthals and interbred. This suggests that contact was not rare but immediate, perhaps inevitable. The Levant, Anatolia, and Central Asia were zones where ranges overlapped. Moving north from Arabia or east from the Levant would have brought Homo sapiens directly into Neanderthal territories. There was no vast wilderness separating them, only landscapes already claimed. Why did this admixture happen now and not during earlier failed expansions? One reason may be demographic. The breakout populations around 70,000 years ago were more numerous and resilient than earlier pioneers. They persisted long enough in Neanderthal territory for encounters to result in lasting genetic exchange. Earlier pulses may have been too small, too short-lived for their DNA to endure. The success of the breakout created the conditions for lasting contact. The genetic consequences of these first encounters are still being unravelled. Neanderthal DNA persists in all non-African genomes today, but it is not evenly distributed. Some regions of the genome show high Neanderthal ancestry, others almost none. In fact, many stretches of Neanderthal DNA were purged over time, likely because they carried harmful mutations that reduced fitness in larger human populations. This suggests that Neanderthals living in small groups for hundreds of thousands of years accumulated genetic burdens that were exposed when their DNA mixed into larger Homo sapiens populations. Even so, a fraction survived, shaping traits from skin physiology to immune responses. At the time, of course, none of this would have been visible. For the people living 60,000 years ago, the encounters were not about genes, but about survival, cooperation, competition, and reproduction. Perhaps alliances formed, sharing of hunting grounds or exchanges of tools. Perhaps there were conflicts over resources or territory. In either case, the result was that the boundaries between them and us blurred in ways our modern categories struggle to capture. The haunting question is what these first encounters felt like. To stand at the edge of a forest or steppe and see a band of Neanderthals approaching would have been to see both difference and similarity reflected back. Did our ancestors see kinship, or did they see rivals? Did they feel curiosity, fear, or something in between? We cannot know their emotions, but we can trace their consequences in our very DNA. What happens when two intelligent species meet? The answer, 60 to 50,000 years ago, was that they mixed. The first encounters were not the end of Neanderthals, nor the triumph of Homo sapiens, but the start of a shared legacy written in genomes. For a brief time, two kinds of humans walked the same landscapes, and in those moments, their histories became entwined. Why did every rival vanish one by one? Between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, the human landscape of the planet changed in ways that can never be reversed. just before this window, Earth was home to multiple kinds of humans. Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across much of Asia, Homo floresiensis clinging to their island refuge in Indonesia, and perhaps other regional populations we have not yet discovered. By the end of this 10,000-year span, only one kind of human remained: us. The diversity of our genus collapsed, leaving Homo sapiens as the sole survivors. This outcome is so complete that we often project it backward, assuming our dominance was inevitable. But the closer we look at the evidence, the less inevitable it appears. These other groups were not evolutionary dead ends from the start. Neanderthals had persisted in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, enduring multiple glacial cycles and mastering cold environments where survival was precarious. Denisovans left genetic traces spread widely across Asia, a sign that their range was vast and their presence long-lasting. Homo floresiensis, with their diminutive stature and small brains, had managed to persist on Flores Island in isolation for tens of thousands of years. They were not fragile anomalies, they were resilient humans who had adapted to their worlds. Yet within this narrow period, they were gone. The reasons for their disappearance are complex and likely varied. Climate change was one factor. The period between 50 and 40,000 years ago was marked by abrupt climatic oscillations, with episodes of cooling and warming that reshaped ecosystems. Yet these groups had survived earlier oscillations, so climate alone cannot explain why they vanished precisely at this moment. Another factor was the arrival and spread of Homo sapiens. Our species expanded into their territories during this window, and the overlap in time and space is too striking to ignore. When Homo sapiens appeared, other humans disappeared. One of the clearest genetic signals comes from the Neanderthals. Every non-African human today carries between 1 and 2% of their DNA, proof of admixture. But when we look closer, we see that much of that DNA has been systematically removed over time. The first generations of hybrid children would have carried far more Neanderthal DNA than we do today. Over tens of thousands of years, selection acted against many of those segments, weeding them out of our genomes. The reason appears to be that Neanderthals, living in small populations for so long, had accumulated many slightly harmful mutations. These mutations did not doom them on their own, but when their DNA entered larger Homo sapiens populations, natural selection stripped them away. Only fragments survived, genes for immunity, skin, and metabolism that happened to confer some advantage. The rest was purged. This purging of Neanderthal DNA is a stark reminder of how thin the line of survival can be. Neanderthals were intelligent, resourceful, and capable, but their long isolation had left them genetically vulnerable. When they mixed with Homo sapiens, their legacy did not vanish immediately, but it was gradually reduced to fragments, diluted by larger populations and pruned by selection. Their extinction was not just cultural or demographic, it was biological. Denisovans tell a parallel story. We know them not from skeletons, but from a few fragments of bone and teeth in Denisova Cave in Siberia. Yet their DNA reveals a vast presence, with genetic contributions found today among populations in East Asia, Papua New Guinea and Australia. Denisovan DNA is especially enriched in genes linked to adaptation to high altitudes, suggesting that they contributed useful traits to humans who later settled the Tibetan Plateau. But Denisovans themselves disappeared. Their bones vanish from the record and their culture is unknown. Like the Neanderthals, they survived not as living populations, but as fragments of DNA scattered across our genomes. On Flores Island, Homo floresiensis endured until around 50,000 years ago. These hobbits, standing just over a metre tall, had brains far smaller than ours, yet left behind stone tools and evidence of hunting. They had survived in isolation for tens of millennia. Then, at the same time Homo sapiens reached Southeast Asia, they vanished. Whether directly through competition, indirectly through ecological change, or through some other factor, their lineage ended. The coincidence of timing is difficult to dismiss. Why did every rival vanish in this narrow window? The simplest explanation is that the spread of Homo sapiens tipped the balance. Our species arrived in their territories with growing numbers, with wider social networks, and perhaps with more flexible toolkits. In contact zones, some groups interbred, but the demographic momentum of Homo sapiens overwhelmed the smaller populations of other humans. Even when genes survived, cultures and bodies did not. Yet it is critical to avoid triumphalism here. Survival does not mean superiority in some moral sense. It means only that circumstances aligned in our favour. Neanderthals had thrived in Europe for far longer than Homo sapiens has yet existed as a species. Denisovans had spanned Asia in ways we're only beginning to uncover. The hobbits of Flores had endured in isolation in a way no Homo sapiens group ever did. Their disappearance was not preordained, it was contingent. If climates had shifted differently, if diseases had spread in other directions, if early Homo sapiens groups had faltered, perhaps it would be their descendants telling the story today. The haunting question is whether our survival came at their expense. Did Homo sapiens actively displace these groups through violence or competition? Or did the expansion of our species simply erode their numbers until they faded away? The evidence is not decisive. We see traces of interaction, admixture and coexistence, but also the stark outcome, extinction. What we know for certain is that between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, the world lost its diversity of humans, and we were left alone. Why did every rival vanish one by one? Because survival is not guaranteed, even for intelligent beings. It depends on population size, genetic health, ecological flexibility, and sheer chance. The extinctions of this period remind us that our current monopoly on humanity was not inevitable. It was the outcome of contingencies layered upon contingencies, choices made and accidents endured, advantages gained and opportunities lost. The world of many humans collapsed into the world of one, and we live in the shadow of that narrowing still. How many of your ancestors were Neanderthals? The simple answer most often given is 2%, because that is roughly the proportion of Neanderthal DNA found in the genomes of present-day non-Africans. But the truth is both more complicated and more astonishing. That 2% represents only the fragments that survived after tens of thousands of years of selection, dilution, and chance. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals first mixed, the proportion of Neanderthal ancestors was much larger. In fact, genetic modelling suggests that 10 to 20% of the people alive in those early mixed populations were Neanderthals. The ghosts inside us are not minor traces, they were once entire communities. The difference between percentage of DNA and percentage of ancestors is crucial. Imagine your own family tree a few generations back. Each of your parents contributes half of your DNA, each grandparent a quarter, each great-grandparent an eighth. But not every ancestor leaves equal genetic footprints. Some segments get passed down intact, others are lost entirely in the shuffle of recombination. Now scale that to thousands of generations. Even if you carry only 2% of Neanderthal DNA today, far more of your distant ancestors were fully Neanderthal individuals whose lineages blended into ours. The dilution of their genetic legacy does not erase their place in the family tree. This reframing forces us to reconsider the line between us and them. If up to 1 in 5 of the ancestors of early Eurasian populations was Neanderthal, then those populations were not pure Homo sapiens in the sense we imagine. They were hybrids, emerging from the blending of two intelligent human groups. Over time, as selection pruned harmful mutations and as Homo sapiens populations grew, the Neanderthal contribution shrank in proportion. But that does not change the fact that many of our ancestors were Neanderthals, who became modernized not by vanishing, but by joining. The genetic evidence for this process comes from the way Neanderthal DNA is distributed in our genomes. It is not scattered randomly. Some regions are rich in Neanderthal-derived variants, especially genes related to immunity, skin, and metabolism. These may have offered adaptive advantages in Eurasian environments, helping early Homo sapiens cope with pathogens, sunlight, and diet. Other regions show near total absence of Neanderthal DNA. These deserts of introgression suggest that Neanderthal variants in those regions were harmful when combined with Homo sapiens genomes and were purged over time. The result is a mosaic. Fragments that proved useful were kept, others erased. When we say we are 2% Neanderthal then, we are speaking about what remains after a long filtering process. The ancestors alive 70,000 to 40,000 years ago were much more deeply mixed. They carried large continuous blocks of Neanderthal DNA, evidence of recent unions within a few generations. The purging of those blocks into fragments happened only later, as populations expanded and natural selection did its quiet work. The people alive during those early centuries of contact would have looked to each other and seen difference, but their children were already blurring the line. The haunting thought is that it may be misleading to say modern humans absorbed Neanderthals. Another way of seeing it is that Neanderthals became modernized, their genes carried forward in a population that grew and spread. Instead of one species triumphing over another, what we see in the genetic record is emerging, followed by a shift in proportions. To ask whether Neanderthals went extinct or survived is to ask the wrong question. They did both. Their distinct populations vanished, but their descendants continued inside of us. This view also reshapes the philosophical question of identity. Are non-African humans today truly Homo sapiens? Or are we a Neanderthal sapiens hybrid lineage that emerged in Eurasia after 70,000 years ago? The answer is both. Taxonomic labels struggle to capture the messy reality of human evolution, where isolation was rarely absolute and mixture was the rule rather than the exception. To imagine ourselves as pure is to ignore the evidence of our own DNA. To imagine Neanderthals as wholly other is to overlook the fact that they are literally in our blood. It is easy to treat these percentages abstractly, but consider what they mean genealogically. If you are of non-African ancestry, then among your ancestors 70,000 years ago, 10 to 20 out of every 100 were Neanderthals. That is not a marginal influence. It means that the people whose lives, loves and struggles shaped the course of history included Neanderthals who hunted mammoths, raised children in caves, and survived Ice Age winters. Their lives did not end in silence. They echo in the genetic code of billions of people today. Yet this legacy is not uniform. Different populations carry different Neanderthal fragments. Some groups in East Asia, for example, appear to carry slightly higher proportions than Europeans. This suggests that interbreeding may have happened multiple times in different regions, with distinct Neanderthal groups contributing to different branches of Homo sapiens. The ghosts inside us are not a single Neanderthal population, but many. Each encounter added its own threads to the tapestry of our ancestry. The implications reach beyond genetics. If we think of Neanderthals as among our actual ancestors, rather than as an extinct species, then our story changes. The question is no longer why they disappeared, but how they live on. The boundaries between modern and archaic blur into a continuum of mixture, selection, and adaptation. The distinction between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens becomes less about biology and more about perspective. From one view, Neanderthals are gone. From another, they are still here, dispersed invisibly inside us. How many of your ancestors were Neanderthals? Far more than the 2% of DNA you carry today suggests. They were perhaps 10 to 20% of the ancestors of early Eurasian populations, gradually absorbed into a lineage that expanded across the world. Their extinction was real, but so was their survival. They are ghosts inside us, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal structure of our genomes. The haunting question is not whether Neanderthals live on, but whether we should stop drawing such sharp lines between them and us at all. Could all of this have failed? By 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had managed to establish itself across a wide span of Eurasia. The bottleneck of 70,000 years ago was behind them. The first encounters with Neanderthals had already reshaped their genomes, and the process of expansion into new lands was underway. But the sense of inevitability we project onto this moment is deceptive. The survival of that small tribe which left Africa was far from guaranteed. The line that connects them to us could have been cut at any moment by climate, disease, or chance. Our global dominance today feels secure only because it has already happened. At the time, it was fragile. Consider climate. The period around 40,000 years ago was one of intense instability. Ice Age conditions waxed and waned, with abrupt cold snaps known as Heinrich events, plunging Europe into harsher conditions within a few decades. Imagine being part of a small band of humans in such a moment, dependent on seasonal migrations of animals, vulnerable to drought, famine, and freezing. A shift in rainfall could dry up rivers, a change in vegetation could collapse herds, entire groups could vanish in a generation. If one of those groups carried the fragile line of ancestry that led to us, then their disappearance would have erased the future we take for granted. Population size magnified this risk. Genetic evidence shows that non-African populations derive from a founder group numbering only a few thousand individuals. In demographic terms, that is a blink away from extinction. Small populations are vulnerable not only to environmental stress but also to random fluctuations, what biologists call genetic drift. A disease striking one camp, a conflict lost, a failed season of hunting could reduce numbers so sharply that recovery was impossible. Survival at such small scales depends as much on luck as on skill. Archaeology underscores how precarious these populations were. Sites from this period often reveal short-term occupations, camps used briefly and abandoned, stone tools scattered in thin layers rather than thick accumulations. These are not the signatures of massive settlements, but of small groups moving restlessly, probing landscapes and leaving faint traces. At times their presence disappears entirely from regions for centuries, only to reappear later. This patchy record reflects not destiny, but struggle. Survival balanced on a knife's edge. The comparison with other human groups sharpens the sense of contingency. Neanderthals had persisted in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, only to vanish during this very window. Denisovans had left a wide genetic footprint but disappeared from the fossil record. Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Flores Island, endured for tens of millennia, but not beyond 50,000 years ago. Each of these groups had been successful in its own context, yet all of them failed to continue. There is no reason to think Homo sapiens could not have joined them. Our survival was not inevitable. It was one outcome among many possible. Could a volcanic eruption have tipped the balance? The eruption of Toba in Sumatra 74,000 years ago may or may not have caused a population crash, but other eruptions surely threatened local groups. A single catastrophe could have erased fragile populations. Could an epidemic have done the same? Small groups are resilient in some ways, but a new pathogen introduced into a camp could spread rapidly through kinship networks. We cannot know what diseases afflicted Pleistocene humans, but the risk was always there. Luck also plays a role that is harder to measure. A chance crossing of a river, a chance avoidance of a storm, a chance alliance between groups, all could mean the difference between survival and oblivion. We often credit our species with adaptability and innovation, and rightly so, but adaptability does not guarantee success. It only improves the odds. The dice still have to fall the right way. Some scholars argue that given enough time, some branch of Homo would have eventually expanded globally, even if Homo sapiens had failed. They point to the parallel evolution of large brains in Neanderthals, the persistence of Denisovans, and the repeated pulses of expansion from Africa. Perhaps if our line had vanished, another would have taken our place, yet this remains speculation. What we know is that one fragile group did survive, and every human alive today descends from them. The haunting question is how close we came to silence. Imagine if one small band in Arabia, carrying a crucial set of lineages, had been wiped out by a drought. Imagine if one crossing into South Asia had ended in failure, leaving no descendants. The line of ancestry would have snapped, and history as we know it would never have unfolded. There would still be humans on Earth, but not us. The species that told stories, built cities, and split the atom might never have existed. Could all of this have failed? Yes. The evidence of other human extinctions makes that clear. What saved us was not inevitability, but a precarious balance of adaptability, opportunity, and chance. We are the product of a survival that was never guaranteed. That knowledge should make us cautious about triumphal narratives. Our ancestors endured not because they were destined to, but because enough of them survived the storms, the cold, the hunger, and the accidents of deep time. Was our expansion like a forest fire? When scientists describe the spread of Homo sapiens across Eurasia in this period, they sometimes turn to that analogy. A forest fire does not burn in a single wave. It flares in sparks and patches, advancing in bursts, leaving some areas untouched, others consumed quickly, and sometimes retreating before surging again. Our expansion looked much the same. Between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, sparks of human groups leapt into Europe, Siberia, and South Asia. Some of these sparks flared brightly for a short time and then went out. Others smouldered and survived. And then, around 39,000 years ago, one wave re-expanded in a more continuous burn, sweeping across vast territories. The evidence of these early sparks is scattered across the archaeological and genetic record. In Siberia, at sites like Ust-Ishim, the genome of a man who lived around 45,000 years ago reveals one of the earliest known Homo sapiens outside Africa and the Levant. His DNA carries long Neanderthal segments, indicating that admixture had occurred only a few generations before he lived. Yet his lineage left no descendants among later populations. He was part of a spark that flared in Siberia, then vanished without continuity. In Europe, too, early modern human remains appear at sites such as Pestera cu Oase in Romania. These individuals lived roughly 40,000 years ago and carried similarly fresh Neanderthal ancestry. Yet once again, their genetic lineages are not found in later Europeans. They were sparks in the forest, brief flames of presence that did not endure. South Asia preserves another piece of the mosaic. Archaeological sites in India and Sri Lanka suggest early human presence in this period, with blade technologies and symbolic artifacts appearing. Yet the genetic evidence from later populations shows complex turnover. Some of the early sparks seem to have been replaced by subsequent waves. The fire spread unevenly, with patches that survived and others that were extinguished. The turning point appears around 39,000 years ago, when a more sustained wave of Homo sapiens began to re-expand across Europe and Asia. Genetic studies reveal that later populations across these regions share ancestry from this re-expansion, rather than from the earlier sparks. It is as if the fire gathered strength, paused, and then surged forward in a more continuous blaze. The earlier sparks were not wasted. They left behind fragments of DNA, cultural traces, and perhaps knowledge of landscapes, but they did not provide the main line of descent. That came from the later wave. Why did some sparks go out while others endured? Part of the answer lies in population size. Small groups venturing into new lands could be extinguished by chance, a failed hunting season, conflict with rivals, or an abrupt climate shift. Genetic evidence shows that many early individuals left no descendants in later populations, even if they lived full lives and raised children. Survival at the scale of species history depends not on individuals but on whether lineages persist across thousands of years. Climate instability played its role too. The period around 40,000 years ago was marked by sudden cold events that reshaped ecosystems. In Europe, shifting temperatures could drive herds away, alter vegetation, and transform habitable valleys into frozen wastelands. Groups that had just arrived might not have had the resilience to adapt quickly. They could vanish in a few generations, their presence remembered only in scattered tools or bones. Another factor was competition with other humans. Neanderthals still occupied much of Europe until roughly 40,000 years ago, and Denisovans lingered in parts of Asia. Encounters with these groups could have been cooperative or hostile, but in either case they added pressure to small Homo sapiens groups trying to establish themselves. Some sparks may have been absorbed, their DNA diluted into other lineages. Others may have been extinguished by direct conflict or by loss of access to resources. The forest fire analogy captures this dynamic well. Expansion was not a smooth front of progress. It was chaotic, patchy, and contingent. Sparks leapt far ahead of the main wave, flared briefly, and died. Others smouldered and joined into larger flames. The fire retreated in some places, surged in others, and only after 39,000 years ago did it burn more continuously. Archaeology shows this in the patchwork of cultures that appear and vanish. In Europe, early blade industries associated with incoming Homo sapiens appear around 40,000 years ago, only to disappear and be replaced by later traditions. In Siberia, sites with human occupation appear early, then go silent, then reappear. The record does not tell a story of inevitability, but of trial and error, persistence and loss. For us today, it is easy to see only the fire that spread successfully, because we are its descendants, but the sparks that went out are equally important. They remind us that expansion was not guaranteed, that many groups tried and failed, and that survival depended as much on contingency as on capability. Had one spark burned longer, the genetic makeup of today's populations might look very different. The haunting question is how many other sparks we will never know about, their traces erased by time, their flames extinguished before they left a mark. Was our expansion like a forest fire? Yes, but a fragile one, flickering and uneven, subject to the winds of climate and the contingencies of chance. Only later did the blaze become continuous. Between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, humanity spread not as a single unstoppable force, but as scattered sparks, most of which went out. Yet enough survived to reignite, and from 39,000 years ago onward, the fire of Homo sapiens spread more relentlessly across the continents. Why did Europe's Neanderthals vanish just after we arrived? For hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens set foot in Europe, Neanderthals had been the undisputed human presence of the continent. They endured glacial cycles, hunted across plains now buried beneath ice, and left behind tools, shelters, and burials that spoke of communities resilient to deep cold. Yet within a few millennia of our arrival, they were gone. Their disappearance around 30,000 to 25,000 years ago marks one of the most haunting transitions in prehistory, the end of our last close relatives as a living presence. The timeline of this extinction is now better understood thanks to advances in radiocarbon dating. Early estimates once placed Neanderthal survival in Europe as late as 28,000 or even 24,000 years ago. But more refined methods, correcting for contamination, suggest that most Neanderthal populations disappeared between 40,000 and 39,000 years ago. Still, small groups may have lingered longer in refuge such as southern Iberia. Caves in Gibraltar, for instance, preserve evidence of late Neanderthal presence, though the dates remain debated. Whether they endured until 30,000 years ago, or vanished a little earlier, the pattern is clear. Their final decline coincided closely with the spread of Homo sapiens across Europe. The question is why? Archaeology shows that Neanderthals were not without sophistication. They produced stone tools of the Mousterian tradition, used fire, and hunted large game cooperatively. They adapted to Ice Age environments with a resilience that would challenge any population. Some even show evidence of symbolic behaviour, such as pigments and ornaments. Yet when Homo sapiens arrived with blade industries and more elaborate social networks, the Neanderthals began to contract. Climate stress alone cannot explain their disappearance. Neanderthals had endured multiple harsh glacial phases before without vanishing. What changed this time was the arrival of another human species competing for the same resources. The overlap between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens sites in Europe shows that the two groups shared landscapes for several thousand years. Genetic evidence reveals that they mixed at times, leaving behind DNA that persists in us today. But mixture did not prevent replacement. As Homo sapiens populations expanded, Neanderthals withdrew into ever smaller refugees until they were gone. One possible factor was demography. Neanderthals lived in smaller, more scattered groups than Homo sapiens. Their overall population size across Europe may never have exceeded a few tens of thousands at any one time. By contrast, incoming Homo sapiens groups, connected by broader networks, may have supported larger and more resilient populations. Small differences in birth rates or survival rates could, over centuries, lead to major demographic shifts. Even without violent conflict, the numerical balance would tip steadily against Neanderthals. Another factor may have been ecological flexibility. Homo sapiens brought with them not only blade tools, but also more versatile hunting strategies, broader diets, and perhaps more efficient social cooperation. These differences need not have been dramatic. A slight advantage in exploiting diverse resources could have allowed Homo sapiens groups to expand more consistently, while Neanderthals remained tied to narrower strategies. Over time, this asymmetry may have translated into survival for one and decline for the other. The Iberian Peninsula is often imagined as the Neanderthals' last refuge. Its southern coasts offered relatively mild climates even during glacial phases, providing a haven where small groups could persist after they had vanished elsewhere. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar has been used to argue that Neanderthals survived there thousands of years longer than in northern Europe. Whether or not this extended survival proves accurate, the symbolism remains potent, a dwindling population clinging to the edge of the continent, while new humans spread across the rest of Europe. In their final centuries, Neanderthals were not passive. They continued to make tools, hunt, and live as they always had. They may even have encountered Homo sapiens not just as competitors, but as neighbours. For a time, Europe may have been home to parallel human communities, distinct yet overlapping, each shaping the landscape in its own way. But this coexistence was temporary. By 25,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had vanished as a living population. The haunting question is what this disappearance felt like to those who lived through it. Did Homo sapiens in Europe know that another kind of human was fading away? Did they notice when the last Neanderthal bands vanished from nearby valleys? Or was it so gradual, so localised, that no one recognised the extinction until it was already complete? For the Neanderthals themselves, did they see the encroachment as a slow erosion of their world, or did they simply adapt until the last group dissolved into silence? Why did Europe's Neanderthals vanish just after we arrived? The most honest answer is that it was not a single cause, but a convergence. Small population size, demographic vulnerability, ecological competition, and the relentless expansion of a new human species. It was not destiny written in biology, but the outcome of fragile circumstances. If the climate had been slightly different, if Neanderthals had been slightly more numerous, if Homo sapiens had arrived a few millennia later, the story might have ended another way. The last rivals of Europe are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their DNA remains in us, their bones remain in caves, and their memory lingers in the haunting realization that we once shared the continent with another kind of human. Their extinction was not inevitable, it was simply what happened, and the question that shadows us is whether in their place we would have fared any differently. What happens when ice locks in both wolves and humans? Around 20,000 years ago, Earth entered one of the coldest and most unforgiving chapters of the Ice Age. This period, known to climate scientists as the last glacial maximum, was the peak of the last ice sheet's expansion. Enormous glaciers spread across North America, Northern Europe and Asia. Sea levels fell more than 100 metres lower than today, exposing vast plains that are now submerged. Wind-blown dust darkened skies over continents, deserts expanded, and rainfall collapsed across many regions. For humans and animals alike, the world shrank to a patchwork of refuges. At the height of the freeze, global average temperatures were at least 6 degrees Celsius colder than now, and in many regions of Eurasia the difference was far greater. The Scandinavian ice sheet reached deep into Central Europe. Britain was joined to continental Europe by frozen plains. In North America, ice covered Canada and extended into the northern United States. Vast areas that had once been habitable were now buried beneath kilometres of ice, or transformed into frozen steppes where only the hardier species could survive. For Homo sapiens, survival meant retreat. Populations that had spread widely during the earlier expansions were forced back into ecological enclaves. Southern Europe, parts of the Near East, refugees in Central and South Asia. Archaeological evidence shows that sites became fewer and more concentrated. In France and Iberia, caves filled with smoke and soot tell of long winters spent under rock shelters. In Italy and the Balkans, human traces cluster in valleys where game could still be found. Genetic evidence confirms the demographic contraction. Many lineages bottlenecked during this period, reducing diversity once again. Animals too were locked into these refugees. Mammoths, reindeer, bison and horses crowded the same landscapes as humans, following shrinking patches of steppe and tundra. Carnivores such as wolves faced the same constraints. In some regions, wolves and humans hunted the same prey and stalked the same herds. This overlap increased encounters, both competitive and opportunistic. We cannot know the full texture of these interactions, but we know they were unavoidable, the ice forced species together in the narrow corridors of survival. The strategies humans adopted were varied. Mobility was both essential and limited. Groups followed herds, yet the herds themselves were restricted to certain pastures. Stone tool industries show adaptations to these conditions. In southwestern Europe, the solitary culture produced finely worked points, carefully crafted for hunting in difficult environments. In Central Europe, the Gravettian peoples developed long-range networks, exchanging materials such as flint, shells, and even pigments across hundreds of kilometres. These exchanges may have been more than economic. They were social lifelines, knitting together scattered groups to share resources, mates, and information. caves became more than temporary shelters. They were hubs of survival, places where entire communities wintered, where fires burned continuously for weeks, and where people recorded their presence with paintings and engravings. The great cave art of this period, from Chauvet to Lascaux, emerged in this context. Some scholars see this as symbolic resilience. When the outside world became unbearable, humans turned inward, inscribing meaning on walls to hold on to identity. Others caution against overinterpretation, but the timing is striking. In the depths of the freeze, cultural expression flourished. Population densities were low, and mortality was high. Children born during the coldest centuries faced extreme risk. Yet populations endured. Archaeological layers show continuity across the harshest centuries, proving that Homo sapiens did not vanish even when conditions worsened beyond anything earlier expansions had faced. Our species bent but did not break. That resilience is one reason we are here to tell the story today. The last glacial maximum was not only a human story. Wolves, too, were trapped in refuges, competing for the same shrinking prey base. Both species hunted reindeer, horses, and bison. Both travelled long distances across snow and ice. Both formed tight-knit social groups centred on cooperation. Encounters between wolves and humans must have been constant, sometimes as competitors at a carcass, sometimes as watchers across a frozen plain. The ice narrowed their worlds until they shared it. Though we will save the deeper story of their relationship for another place, the shared context matters. The same freeze that locked humans into caves also locked wolves into closer proximity with us. Survival pressed species together, and boundaries blurred. The fragility of this survival should not be underestimated. Genetic models suggest that effective population sizes of Homo sapiens outside Africa may have fallen dramatically during this period. We were never numerous, and in the coldest centuries we were fewer still. A bad run of seasons, a failed hunt or disease could have tipped groups into extinction. Some lineages did disappear, their traces lost. The ones that survived carried us through the bottleneck of the last glacial maximum, but it was a close thing. One of the most haunting aspects of this period is that it forced cooperation at larger scales. Archaeological evidence for long-distance trade is stronger than in earlier millennia. Ivory and shells from distant coasts appear far inland. Pigments travel hundreds of kilometres. This suggests that groups sought connections beyond their immediate families, forging ties that allowed resources and knowledge to move across wide networks. When the world shrank, humans responded by widening their social ties. It may have been this ability to expand connections rather than contract that made survival possible. What happens when ice locks in both wolves and humans? The answer is that species either adapt together or perish separately. Around 20,000 years ago, the planet pressed us into the narrowest of corridors, testing whether a small, scattered species could endure. The fact that we did is not proof of inevitability. It is proof of resilience under pressure, of cooperation when resources ran thin, and of a fragile persistence through one of the coldest chapters of the Ice Age. The haunting question that lingers is how close we came to losing it all in the cold. Why do some genomes still whisper of unknown ancestors? When we think of ancient humans outside Africa, the familiar names are Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the East, and Homo sapiens spreading into new lands. Yet the genetic record does not resolve into so simple a picture. Instead it hums with faint signals, mismatched fragments that suggest other groups once walked the landscapes of South and Southeast Asia. Some of these groups are known only from DNA, not from bones. Others are hinted at by scattered fossils whose affinities are uncertain. Together they form an unseen chorus, the ghost lineages of Asia. The Denisovans are the clearest part of this mystery, yet even they resist neat definition. First identified from a finger bone and a few teeth in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, their DNA revealed a group distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. But as more genomes were compared, it became clear that there was not one Denisovan lineage, but several. Populations in East Asia, Papua New Guinea and Australia carry different patterns of Denisovan ancestry, suggesting that there were at least 2 or 3 separate Denisovan groups scattered across Asia. These groups had diverged hundreds of thousands of years earlier, long before Homo sapiens arrived. The implications are striking. Rather than a single Denisovan population confined to Siberia, we must imagine a patchwork of Denisovan peoples spread across vast distances. Some lived in the cold mountains of Central Asia. Others may have thrived in tropical forests. Their range may have extended from the highlands of Tibet to the islands of Southeast Asia. Genetic studies of modern populations show that Tibetans, for example, carry a Denisovan-derived gene variant that helps them cope with low oxygen at high altitudes. Papuan and Australian Aboriginal peoples carry different Denisovan segments altogether. These traces could not come from a single source. They point to multiple encounters with different Denisovan groups, each leaving its own genetic echo. The deeper mystery is that Denisovans are not the only ghosts. In South and Southeast Asia, genomes of present-day populations sometimes carry fragments that cannot be explained by either Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry. These fragments suggested mixture with other archaic humans, groups not yet identified in the fossil record. Some may represent deeply diverged Denisovan branches, others entirely separate species. We do not yet know. The DNA is like a faint shadow on the wall, enough to say something was there, not enough to say what it was. Archaeology provides tantalizing hints but little certainty. Fossils from Southeast Asia, skulls and teeth from sites like Tampaling in Laos, Naya Cave in Borneo, and Calao Cave in the Philippines show a bewildering diversity of forms. Some look like early modern humans, others show archaic features that do not fit easily into known categories. On Flores Island, Homo floresiensis persisted until around 50,000 years ago. On Luzon in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis, another small-bodied human, left bones dated to about the same time. Whether these groups contributed DNA to modern populations is unknown, but their presence proves that Asia was far from empty when Homo sapiens arrived. The period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago was one of profound mixing in this region. As Homo sapiens expanded into South Asia, Southeast Asia and beyond, they encountered not only Neanderthals and Denisovans, but likely multiple other archaic groups. Some of these encounters left genetic legacies, others did not. The resulting population structures were complex. South Asia today, for example, carries evidence of multiple layers of ancestry, ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and deep archaic signals from before. In Southeast Asia and Oceania, the admixture with Denisovan-like groups was especially strong, leaving a genetic legacy that still shapes the biology of millions. What makes these echoes particularly haunting is their asymmetry. Neanderthal DNA is found in all non-Africans, but Denisovan ancestry is concentrated in specific populations, sometimes at levels of 5% or more. The ghost fragments from other archaics are rarer still, scattered faintly, as if most of those lineages were swallowed without trace. This pattern suggests that encounters were local and episodic. A small band of Homo sapiens might have merged with a local archaic group in one valley or island, leaving descendants who carried that DNA forward. Elsewhere, other groups passed without meeting or without interbreeding. The result is a patchwork of whispers, uneven and incomplete. From the perspective of those who lived it, these encounters were not abstractions. They were meetings between groups who saw one another face to face, who perhaps shared food, tools, or mates. We cannot know the social dynamics, whether peaceful or violent, whether alliances or coercion, but the genetic evidence proves that unions happened and children were born. For those children, their ancestry was not a question of species but of family. Only thousands of years later do we separate their parents into categories. The haunting question is how many groups we have yet to discover. Every time new genomes are sequenced from ancient remains, surprises emerge. The first Denisovan was identified from a fragment so unremarkable that it was nearly discarded. What else waits in caves and sediments across Asia? How many ghost lineages lived, thrived, and vanished without leaving skeletons for us to find? Our current view is shaped as much by accidents of preservation as by the true diversity of the past. Why do some genomes still whisper of unknown ancestors? Because the story of humanity in Asia was not a simple replacement. It was a braided stream with multiple channels converging, diverging, and rejoining. Denisovans in several forms, Neanderthals on the fringes, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, and perhaps others we have yet to name, all were part of the human landscape into which Homo sapiens expanded. Their legacies survive not in stone tools or fossils, but in the faint signals of DNA that drift through us still. The haunting resolution is that we are not alone even in our own bodies. Every genome outside Africa carries echoes of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other ghosts. To walk in Asia 50,000 years ago was to walk in a continent crowded not with one kind of human, but with many. Today only one survives, but the whispers of the others remain, reminders of how incomplete our knowledge still is. Were we really one species, or many, almost humans? At first glance, the label Homo sapiens suggests unity, a single lineage sweeping out of Africa and expanding across the world. But the closer we look at the evidence, the more that unity blurs. Between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, the humans we call modern were not a single uniform population. They were a patchwork of groups, scattered across continents, often isolated, often mixing with others, and carrying within them deep lineages that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. We were not one thread, but a braided stream. In Africa itself, where our species first took shape, genetic studies reveal profound substructure. Modern populations across the continent retain signals of ancestry from groups that split from one another 200,000 or more years ago. Some of these groups remained separate for tens of thousands of years before reconnecting. The San peoples of southern Africa, for example, carry genetic lineages that diverged extremely early in our history, lineages that remind us how ancient human diversity was within Africa, long before expansion beyond it. Other African groups preserve evidence of admixture with ghost populations, archaic humans within Africa itself, cousins who contributed DNA but have left no fossils we can assign. Outside Africa, the picture was even more complex. As Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia, they met Neanderthals and Denisovans, as we have seen, but also absorbed genes from other groups whose names we do not know. The genome of a young girl found in Denisova Cave, for instance, revealed that her mother was Neanderthal and her father Denisovan. Hybrids were not theoretical, they were real individuals. Other genomes show fragments of ancestry that cannot be traced to either of these groups, suggesting still more lineages existed. Some of these ghost contributions may come from groups that diverged from us more than 500,000 years ago. This braided model of human evolution contrasts sharply with the older image of a simple tree. The tree imagined branches splitting cleanly. Modern humans here, Neanderthals there, Denisovans somewhere else. But the DNA does not fit that picture. Instead, branches bent back into one another, carrying genes across groups that were distinct yet compatible. The metaphor of a trellis or braided stream better captures the reality. Separate strands diverged, flowed alongside each other, merged and separated again. Our species was not born once, but shaped repeatedly by these braidings. Fossil evidence supports this view of diversity disguised within a single name. Skulls from North Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, dated between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, show striking variation. Some have elongated brain cases, others broader faces, others combinations of features. All are now classified as early Homo sapiens, but they do not look identical. They remind us that modern was not a sudden threshold, but a mosaic of traits appearing in different places at different times. Even within the time frame of 50,000 to 20,000 years ago, the differences among Homo sapiens groups would have been visible. Populations in Europe, South Asia, East Asia, and Australia diverged as they spread into new environments. Isolation fostered distinct adaptations. Some lineages may have carried more archaic DNA than others, giving them subtle differences in physiology. If we could stand among them, we might notice variations in stature, in skull shape, in facial features, variations greater than those we see today, yet all belonged to the broader network we call Homo sapiens. The genetic record also reveals how much of this diversity has been lost. Many lineages that flourished 50,000 years ago left no descendants today. We see them only as faint signals in ancient genomes, like ghost rivers that once fed the stream but then dried up. Others were absorbed, their distinctiveness dissolved into larger populations. What survives in us is not the full spectrum of human diversity that once existed, but the fragments that happen to endure. The question of whether we were one species or many almost humans is more philosophical than biological. From a strict reproductive standpoint, the groups interbred. That alone is enough to place them in the same species. But from a cultural and ecological standpoint, the divisions were real. Groups lived apart for tens of thousands of years, adapted to different environments, and may have seen one another as profoundly different. To them, the category of human may not have been uniform. To us, the boundaries are blurred by time. What this diversity teaches us is humility. The story of Homo sapiens is not the story of a chosen lineage destined for global success. It is the story of a network of populations, some of which survived, many of which did not. The unity we see today is the result of contractions, extinctions, and mixtures that reduce the complexity of the past into the illusion of simplicity. We are the last surviving braid of a stream that once had many channels. Were we really one species, or many almost humans? The most accurate answer is both. Biologically, we were one, but within that one lay immense diversity, much of it now gone. The haunting resolution is that our apparent uniformity today is the product not of inevitability but of loss. The richness of human variation has been pruned by time, leaving us with the remnants of what was once far more complex. We carry ghosts in our DNA, reminders of cousins who are us, yet not quite us, and whose echoes shape us still. Was agriculture inevitable, or just lucky timing? To us, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming feels like the hinge upon which human history turns. Cities, writing, states, and eventually the modern world all flow from it. Yet when we step back into deep time, the inevitability of this shift becomes less obvious. For nearly 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived as foragers, thriving in diverse environments without cultivating fields. Then, in the early Holocene around 10,000 years ago, farming appeared in multiple parts of the world, almost simultaneously on the scale of archaeology. Was this convergence the outcome of destiny, written into the trajectory of human intelligence, or the product of contingency, a set of lucky circumstances that happened to align? The Holocene climate set the stage. After the last glacial maximum ended, global temperatures rose, ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, rainfall patterns stabilized, and ecosystems shifted. For 2 million years before, Earth had swung between glacial and interglacial states, each lasting tens of thousands of years. But the Holocene, beginning roughly 12,000 years ago, was unusually stable. Over the following millennia, temperatures fluctuated only within a narrow band compared to earlier eras. This relative stability allowed plants and animals to thrive in consistent patterns, creating opportunities for humans to experiment with domestication. Without this climatic window, farming might not have taken root. Independent centres of agriculture emerged across the globe. In the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, wild wheat and barley were first cultivated. Sheep and goats were domesticated, followed later by cattle and pigs. In East Asia, rice was domesticated in the Yangtze Valley, millet in the Yellow River Basin. In the Americas, maize arose from Teosinte and Mesoamerica, while potatoes and quinoa were cultivated in the Andes. In Papua New Guinea, people domesticated taro and yams in the highlands. These developments were not borrowed from a single origin, but were parallel inventions. Each arose from local species, local knowledge, and local need. This convergence raises the question of inevitability. Did human societies, given enough time, inevitably discover agriculture wherever conditions allowed? Or was the clustering of these events around 10,000 years ago a coincidence shaped by unique post-Ice Age circumstances? The fact that agriculture arose independently in such distant places suggests some degree of inevitability. But the fact that it did not happen during earlier warm periods, such as the Eemian interglacial about 120,000 years ago, points to contingency. Something about the Holocene was different. Archaeologists debate why agriculture did not emerge earlier. Some argue that the Holocene's stable climate was uniquely favourable, while earlier interglacials were more variable. Others suggest that cultural and demographic factors mattered more. that human populations needed to reach a certain density for farming to become advantageous. Foragers in sparse environments may have had little incentive to settle down since wild resources were plentiful. Only when populations grew and competition increased did the labour of cultivation pay off. Still others emphasised the role of chance discoveries, the recognition that seeds dropped near camp sprouted into useful plants, or that wild animals could be tamed and bred. The consequences of agriculture were profound, but not uniformly positive. Farming supported larger populations, but it also tied people to narrower diets, increased vulnerability to crop failure, and fostered inequality. Skeletal remains from early farmers often show signs of nutritional stress compared to their foraging predecessors. Infections spread more easily in denser settlements, yet over time the advantages of scale, more food, more children, more resources, overwhelmed these disadvantages. Farming societies expanded, while purely foraging groups contracted. The independent origins of agriculture highlight the braided, contingent nature of human history. In the Near East, it began with cereals and livestock. In East Asia, with rice and millet. In the Americas, with maize and tubers. Each was a local solution to local conditions, yet all converged on the same transformative shift. If one region had failed, another might still have succeeded. But if none had succeeded, human history would look unrecognisably different. There would be no cities, no states, no written records. Perhaps small bands of foragers would still roam the continents, as they had for most of our history. The haunting question is whether agriculture was a guaranteed outcome of human intelligence or a fragile accident of circumstance. If the Holocene had not provided its rare climatic stability, would farming ever have arisen? If populations had not reached critical densities in multiple regions, would the incentive have existed? If chance discoveries had not accumulated, would foraging have remained the dominant mode of life? We cannot know. What we can say is that our world is built on a set of contingencies that aligned 10,000 years ago. Agriculture was not the only path forward. It was simply the one that happened. Was agriculture inevitable, or just lucky timing? The answer lies somewhere between. The convergence across multiple regions suggests that human ingenuity, given the right conditions, will push toward cultivation. But the fact that it took so long and required such a unique climate reminds us that history could have unfolded very differently. Civilizations as we know them are not written into the fabric of humanity. They are the outcome of one moment of alignment, a fragile turn in a long and contingent story. Yet even as farming spread, it did not do so everywhere, nor did it erase the diversity of human lifeways overnight. Large parts of Australia remained the domain of hunter-gatherers until the arrival of Europeans. Much of the African rainforest remained inhospitable to early agriculture, and mobile foraging strategies persisted for millennia. In the arid steppes of Central Asia, pastoralism, herding animals without reliance on intensive crops, emerged as an alternative. These exceptions matter because they remind us that agriculture was not a universal solution, but one choice among many, adopted where conditions favoured it and resisted where they did not. The spread of agriculture was often uneven even within regions. Early farmers in the Fertile Crescent cultivated wheat and barley, but neighbouring groups sometimes held to foraging for centuries before adopting cultivation. In the Americas, maize took thousands of years to transform from a small grass with few kernels into the staple crop that supported large populations. Domestication was a slow experiment, requiring generations of careful selection, patience, and persistence. Far from a sudden revolution, it was a long process of trial and error that only looks inevitable in hindsight. Another layer of contingency lies in the specific plants and animals available. Eurasia's Fertile Crescent had a fortunate cluster of species suited to domestication, cereals that could be easily harvested and stored, and herd animals that were social, manageable, and productive. Other regions lacked such candidates. In North America, despite abundant wildlife, no large mammal was successfully domesticated, which limited the scope of agricultural societies there. This uneven distribution of domesticable species shaped the future geography of power. It was not intelligence alone that determined outcomes, but the luck of what grew in the valleys and grazed on the hillsides. The Holocene stability that enabled agriculture is itself precarious in retrospect. It was not a permanent gift, but a climatic window. That window has already begun to close under modern warming. To reflect on the contingency of civilization is also to recognise its fragility. If the Holocene climate had fluctuated as wildly as earlier periods, if droughts or freezes had disrupted those first experiments, farming might never have taken hold. The trajectory of humanity could have remained one of small mobile groups endlessly adapting to shifting environments. The resolution is humbling. Civilizations rose not because humans were destined for them, but because circumstances aligned. Climate stability, local resources, population density, and sheer luck. Our modern world rests on that fragile alignment. To ask if agriculture was inevitable is to ask whether civilization itself was. The only honest answer is that it was possible, but never guaranteed. How do entire populations vanish in centuries? When we look at the deep prehistory of Europe, the archaeological record often feels slow. Pottery styles shift, farming spreads, villages rise and fall. Yet genetic evidence tells a more dramatic story, one in which entire populations are replaced within a handful of generations. Between 5,000 and 3,500 years ago, the peoples of the Eurasian steppe carried out one of the most far-reaching demographic turnovers ever detected, reshaping the ancestry of Europe in ways still visible today. The steppe, stretching from north of the Black and Caspian Seas across thousands of kilometres of grassland, was home to the Yamnaya. These were mobile herders who thrived between about 5,300 and 4,600 years ago. Their way of life combined domesticated animals, the use of wheeled carts, and, most significantly, the horse. These elements gave them extraordinary mobility, allowing them to expand across vast distances with speed unmatched by earlier farming societies. Archaeological traces of the Yamnaya include Kurgan burial mounds, often containing individuals with rich grave goods, symbols of a society where mobility, livestock wealth, and perhaps warrior prestige were deeply valued. The genetic evidence is striking. Ancient DNA shows that the Yamnaya carried a distinct signature, and as they expanded, that signature appears suddenly across large parts of Europe. The corded ware culture, which spread across Central and Northern Europe between about 4,900 and 4,300 years ago, shows overwhelming ancestry from the Yamnaya. This was not a subtle influence or minor trickle. In some regions, more than 70% of ancestry was suddenly steppe-derived. In the Y chromosome record, which traces paternal lines, the shift was even starker. Local male lineages virtually disappear, replaced almost entirely by steppe-derived ones. What explains such a dramatic transformation? Archaeologists have long debated whether these changes were invasions, migrations, or cultural diffusions. The DNA leaves little doubt that they involved the movement of large numbers of people. The corded ware expansion in Central Europe and the later Beaker phenomenon in Western Europe carried steppe ancestry across the continent. Within only a few centuries, the genetic landscape of Europe was transformed. Iberia provides a clear example. Around 4,500 years ago, populations with Beaker pottery appear in the archaeological record. For decades, scholars argued about whether this represented new ideas or new people. Genetic studies now show it was both. Around 40% of Iberian ancestry was replaced by steppe-derived populations, and on the paternal side the effect was near total. The Y chromosome lineages of local men vanish almost completely, replaced by those of incoming groups. Yet mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, retains continuity. The genetic record suggests that local women remained part of the population, while local men contributed little to later generations. What could cause such a pattern? Explanations range from social practices to violence to disease. Some researchers have proposed that female mate choice could have favoured newcomers, but the scale of the shift suggests that more disruptive forces were at work. Archaeological evidence from mass graves and fortified sites points to conflict. Ancient DNA also reveals the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that later caused the Black Death. It appears in human remains from this period, though its role in population turnovers is still debated. If plague spread across early Europe, it could have weakened local populations and created openings for expanding groups. Britain provides another dramatic case. Before the Beaker expansion, the population descended largely from earlier farmers, who had themselves replaced Mesolithic hunter-gatherers millennia earlier. Around 4,400 years ago, Beaker-associated populations arrived. Within a few centuries, more than 90% of the ancestry in Britain derived from these newcomers. Once again, local male lineages disappeared almost entirely. The replacement was not subtle, it was near total. This raises unsettling questions about how quickly human landscapes can change. Entire traditions of ancestry, built over thousands of years, could vanish in a handful of centuries. To the individuals living through it, this would not have been an abstract demographic event. It would have been the loss of neighbours, the decline of familiar customs, the arrival of strangers whose ways became dominant. Yet for all its drama, this process did not erase the past entirely. Fragments of earlier ancestries persisted, braided into the new genetic fabric, reminders of the people who came before. One of the most interesting aspects of the steppe replacements is how they connect with language. Many linguists believe that the Indo-European language family spread with these migrations, carried by mobile pastoralists whose descendants came to speak tongues that today span from Hindi to English. The archaeological and genetic evidence does not prove this, but it makes the possibility plausible. The languages we speak today may carry echoes of the same expansions that transformed Europe's DNA. How do entire populations vanish in centuries? The answer lies in a combination of mobility, demographic advantage, ecological opportunity, and perhaps disease. The Yamnaya and their successors moved swiftly, carried by horses, carts, and herds. They brought new technologies and social structures. They encountered populations weakened by environmental stresses or pathogens, and in the space of a few centuries they reshaped the genetic and cultural map of Europe. The haunting resolution is that human history is not always slow. Sometimes it turns in bursts, with one group vanishing almost overnight in the scale of deep time. The steppe replacements remind us that our world has been built not just by gradual evolution but by abrupt transformations. The faces of Europe today bear the legacy of those who swept across the continent 5,000 years ago, while the voices of those who came before are heard only faintly, in fragments of DNA and the stones they left behind. The speed and scale of the steppe replacements force us to ask how ordinary people experienced them. Archaeology shows that even during this period of transformation, daily life still revolved around farming, herding, and seasonal rhythms. Pottery styles shifted, burial traditions changed, and new tools appeared, but much of the routine of survival must have felt familiar. For many communities, the world did not end overnight. It slowly changed shape as newcomers arrived, intermarriage occurred, and older traditions lost ground. A field might still be ploughed, but the language spoken over it could shift within a generation. What stands out in the genetic record is not only the disappearance of male lineages, but the persistence of female ones. This imbalance hints at power dynamics we can scarcely reconstruct. Were local women incorporated willingly into new communities, or were they absorbed under pressure? The truth may lie somewhere in between, varying from region to region. In some places, alliances and marriages may have smoothed the way. In others, violence or coercion may have left a sharper mark. The genome does not tell us motives, only outcomes. Women carried forward much of the ancestry, men far less. One possibility that deserves attention is the role of ideology. In some steppe cultures, male initiation rituals and warrior bands seem to have been central. If such groups expanded aggressively, their success could have produced the skewed genetic legacy we now observe. In that sense, replacement was not only about physical expansion, but also about cultural systems that favoured certain lines of descent over others. Archaeology alone cannot confirm this, but the pattern of genetic turnover hints at more than random chance. Disease adds another layer of contingency. The detection of plague DNA in human remains from this period suggests that pathogens were already shaping human history long before the medieval Black Death. In sparsely populated farming villages, outbreaks may have been devastating, opening the door for steppe groups to expand into newly emptied territories. If so, the replacement of populations was not purely a contest of strength, but also a grim lottery of survival against microbes. The broader lesson of the steppe replacements is how fragile continuity can be. Communities that had endured for millennia, tracing their ancestry back to the first farmers of Europe, were largely erased in a few centuries. This fragility should temper our assumptions about permanence. Civilizations, languages, and lineages that feel enduring are, in fact, contingent. The story of the Yamnaya, Corded Ware, and Beaker peoples is not just about who lived in Europe 5,000 years ago. It is about how swiftly the ground beneath identity can shift, and how little of the past is guaranteed to survive the next upheaval. Did we conquer the world, or just inherit a fragile chance? When we look back across the long arc from 70,000 years ago to the present, the story of Homo sapiens can easily be mistaken for one of inevitability. A small group leaves Africa, it spreads across continents, rivals vanish, and eventually every shore carries our footprints. But when we trace the evidence carefully, the picture that emerges is not one of destined triumph, but of narrow survivals, lucky timings, and fragile continuities that could have broken at any moment. What we call victory is in many ways the accumulation of chance that happened to fall in our favour. That tiny founding group, perhaps no more than a few thousand people, could easily have vanished in the shifting climates of the Ice Age. The bottleneck reduced our genetic diversity to a narrow thread, one that made us more alike but also more vulnerable. We carry the traces of that fragility still in the way our DNA shows so little variation compared to other primates. For reasons we do not fully understand, this thread endured. Whether in Arabia, along the Nile, or on the coasts of East Africa, those ancestors managed to hold on, and from them the great expansion began. Yet their success was not the erasure of others alone. At every step we absorbed as much as we displaced. Neanderthal blood still flows in us. Denisovan fragments still shape traits from immunity to altitude adaptation. And within Africa itself, multiple deep lineages braided together to form the ancestry we call modern. We are not a pure branch, but a mosaic of many, stitched together through encounter, union, and survival. Our so-called conquest was less a march of superiority, and more the persistence of one network of populations through waves of mixing, often at the expense of others. Extinction shadows this story. Denisovans, Neanderthals, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, all of them endured for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, only to vanish within a few millennia of our expansion. Some fell quickly, others lingered in refuges before fading away. We do not know the full balance of causes, climate stress, competition, disease, or sheer bad luck, but their disappearance makes clear that our presence today rests on their absence. It is sobering to realize that our so-called dominance required the silencing of entire other human ways of being. Even after the last rivals were gone, fragility remained. The last glacial maximum nearly squeezed us again into corners of survival. Later waves of population replacement, from the steppe expansions to epidemics, remind us how easily one group's continuity can be erased by another. If our world feels stable now, it is only because we live in its aftermath. For most of history, survival was provisional. The lesson in all of this is humility. The victory of Homo sapiens was not inevitable, nor was it complete in the sense of erasing diversity. It was fragile, stitched from chance survivals, shaped by mixture with rivals, and dependent on climate windows that could have easily closed differently. To say we conquered the world is to forget how close we came to losing it, again and again. At 2 a.m, when the mind spirals through deep time, this realization can be both unsettling and strangely comforting. Unsettling, because it strips away the idea of destiny. Comforting, because it reveals that existence itself is remarkable. That we are here at all, that our ancestors persisted through droughts, freezes, plagues, and displacements, is extraordinary. We are the descendants of survivors not because they were guaranteed to succeed, but because, against the odds, they did. Did we conquer the world, or just inherit a fragile chance? Perhaps both. We spread farther than any of our cousins, but our path was narrow, fragile, and contingent. To tell the story of Homo sapiens is to tell the story of a species that did not win by strength alone, but by persistence, by luck, and by the quiet endurance of small bands who refused to vanish. Our fragility was never erased. It is written into our genes and into the silences left behind by those who are gone. We live in their absence and in the precarious continuity of one improbable line. If there is a paradox in our story, it is that fragility often coexisted with resilience. The very smallness of human groups may have been their saving grace. A species numbering in the low tens of thousands could move with agility, adapt to shifting climates, and explore new ecological niches without overwhelming them. Small numbers also meant that when catastrophes struck, whether droughts, volcanic winters, or sudden freezes, pockets of people could retreat, endure in isolation, and later reconnect. The braided stream of our ancestry depended on these fragmentations and reunions. If we had been more numerous, our flexibility might have been lost. The archaeological record hints at these hidden survivals. In places where climate models suggest conditions were nearly unlivable, we still find traces of fire, flint and bone. A hearth here, a scatter of tools there. Each tiny site is evidence of persistence against odds. These were not great civilizations nor lasting settlements, but fragile footholds. Yet each one represents the thread that carried us through. To call that conquest would be misleading. To call it luck feels too dismissive. Perhaps the best word is endurance. Thin, temporary, and always contingent. The fragility of our victory is also reflected in the genetic record. Modern humans outside Africa carry reduced diversity compared to our African cousins. That reduction is the echo of the bottlenecks we pass through. Fewer lineages meant less variation, less resilience to disease, and greater vulnerability to chance. And yet the same narrowing produced the shared ancestry that allowed our species to spread a common identity across continents. Fragility and strength were two sides of the same coin. If we shift the lens from genes to culture, the pattern holds. Knowledge was easy to lose. As we saw in the case of isolated groups who forgot techniques for making fire, human culture did not always march forward. For tens of thousands of years, progress was uneven, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating. What eventually accumulated into agriculture, cities, and science was built on many near misses and many losses. If we had been less fragile, perhaps we would have moved faster. If we had been less lucky, perhaps we would never have moved at all. The extinction of other human lineages adds a layer of melancholy to our fragile survival. We do not live in a world that was destined to belong to one species. We live in the ruins of a shared humanity that was pruned by time. Each vanished group, whether Neanderthal, Denisovan, or one of the ghosts whose DNA we detect but cannot name, represents a different possible future that never came to be. Their disappearance was not a simple conquest, but a complicated mosaic of mixing, competition, and chance. Inheriting the Earth was not so much a victory as a narrowing of possibilities. The irony is that fragility can be mistaken for dominance when viewed from far away. To future eyes, our survival might look like conquest, a steady march toward global spread. But when examined up close, the march was stuttering, vulnerable, and often close to failure. The broad sweep of history hides the knife edge upon which it was balanced. Every hearth that burned in a cave at the edge of a glacier was a gamble with extinction. Every child who survived famine or illness carried the possibility of an entire lineage forward. Our dominance is stitched from millions of such fragile threads. At 2 a.m, when the mind turns to these questions, the comfort lies not in destiny, but in contingency. To know that we are here not because we were the strongest or the cleverest, but because we happened to endure, is to see ourselves as part of a larger, humbler story. The fact that existence is not guaranteed makes it more remarkable. The world could have been filled with different humans, or perhaps none at all. Instead, it is filled with us, the descendants of survivors who made it through by chance, by cooperation, and by persistence. The haunting question that lingers is whether we will recognize the fragility of our own survival today. The bottlenecks and extinctions of the past remind us that continuity is never guaranteed. Our story was written in narrow escapes, not assured triumphs. If we forget that, we risk mistaking fragility for permanence once again. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.